Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most shocking and unsettling investigations in modern American true crime. The arrest of a quiet, seemingly ordinary architect from Long Island, and a mystery that had haunted the Gilgo Beach community for more than a decade. Rex Heuermann. For years, he blended into the rhythm of New York life. A man who rode the subway, walked the same Manhattan streets as millions of others, and returned each night to a modest home tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Massapequa Park. To colleagues, he was a professional. To neighbors, he was unremarkable. To the world, he was almost invisible. But behind the surface of everyday life, investigators were walking a 13-year trail of phone records, digital footprints, and unanswered questions, a trail that would eventually lead them to his doorstep. This is not a story of guilt or certainty. This is the story of an investigation. The clues that drew detectives closer, the mystery that began with a single body on a beach, and the moment when a quiet man in an ordinary neighborhood became the center of one of the most watched cases in the country. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Our late-night true crime family stretches across time zones, and I'm glad you're here. Now settle in. Let the noise of the day fade, and follow me into the long, quiet shadows of Gilgo Beach, a place where questions linger, answers come slowly, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. This is True Crime Records. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1: The Quiet Architect in the Crowd. For most of his life, Rex Heuermann seemed like someone the world would overlook. He moved through the dense, endless current of New York City the same way thousands of commuters did, stepping onto trains with a coffee in hand, weaving through crowds near Penn Station, unlocking the door to a modest midtown office where blueprints and contracts filled his days. And in a city filled with noise, flash, ambition, and power, he was not the kind of man anyone pointed at. He was the kind of man people moved past without a second thought. By the early 2000s, he had built a quiet career as an architect. His office sat in a building most pedestrians never looked up at, and the window he worked behind held no hint of the story waiting to unfold years later. Clients described him as meticulous, serious, and reserved. He wasn't the type to joke loudly in hallways or linger at afterwork gatherings. He spoke methodically, explained things precisely, and kept almost everything about his personal life sealed away from the world. Across state lines, far from Manhattan's bustle, a very different story was beginning along a sandy stretch of coastline in Long Island. Gilgo Beach, windswept, isolated, and quiet, would become the center of a mystery that grew year after year. What started as one discovery became two, then more, until an entire community felt the weight of a question that no one could answer. Who was responsible for the remains found near the brush and tall grass along Ocean Parkway? Investigators from Suffolk County sifted through early clues with caution. Timelines were uncertain. Causes of death were not immediately clear. And for years, attempts to connect the cases led to dead ends and shadows. Hints but not conclusions, patterns but not proof. Detectives pored over missing persons reports, phone data, and the scattered fragments of lives cut short, but nothing pointed decisively to one person. While law enforcement was struggling through this maze of unanswered questions, Heuermann continued living the kind of life that drew almost no attention. Neighbors described him in simple terms: quiet, kept to himself, always busy. His home in Massapequa Park was an unassuming house on a peaceful street, a place where the seasons came and went, children grew up, and families lived without imagining that one day reporters and investigators would stand on their lawns. People saw him mowing his yard, walking to his car, or carrying bags of groceries into the house. He was polite when spoken to, though rarely talkative. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at the storm that would eventually shape how the nation spoke his name. Meanwhile, back on Gilgo Beach, years of frustration slowly gave way to new technology, new leadership, and a renewed determination to break the case open. Digital forensics had advanced. Old data could be re-examined. Phone records could be mapped with precision that didn't exist a decade earlier. The fragmented pieces that once refused to fit together began forming a picture. Not a complete one, but one clear enough that investigators finally felt momentum. Detectives tracked phone interactions, cross-referenced timelines, and followed new threads that pointed toward a suspect profile. They studied data from cell sites, vehicle registrations, and background information that might overlap with the mystery taking place along Ocean Parkway. Each new clue was handled carefully, not as proof, but as part of an expanding web of possibilities. During this time, Heuermann's life appeared unchanged. He continued taking on architectural projects, attending routine appointments, and commuting by train. His workdays ended in the same predictable rhythm: paperwork, drafting plans, updating clients, locking the office door. His nights ended in Massapequa Park, a neighborhood where porch lights glowed softly and residents waved to each other while unloading groceries or walking dogs. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man in an ordinary life. By the late 2010s, the Gilgo investigation intensified. A task force expanded. Agencies began combining resources. And for the first time, investigators felt they were closing in, not on a name, but on a pattern. Something in the data pointed to a figure who existed between two worlds, one in Manhattan, one on Long Island. Someone who lived a life structured enough to go unnoticed, yet intersected with the areas investigators were studying. It would take more time, months of surveillance, analysis, and quiet observation, before investigators would focus on a single individual. But as part one of this chapter closes, the most important point is this: the story of Rex Heuermann, as the world came to know it, did not begin with a dramatic moment or a sudden revelation. It began with silence, with a man who moved through life quietly, and an investigation that had spent years waiting for a path to follow. As the years passed, the contrast between Rex Heuermann's quiet routine and the growing intensity of the Gilgo Beach investigation became sharper, though no one outside law enforcement could see the threads tightening. To his colleagues in Manhattan, Heuermann was simply the architect they had always known: focused, serious, somewhat awkward, and entirely predictable. He arrived early, stayed late, and rarely shared much about his personal life. If he felt the pressure of anything beyond his drafting table, it didn't show. Inside his office, shelves were lined with building models and thick binders of past projects. He had a reputation for solving complex structural problems, and clients often mentioned the same quality. He was meticulous. He double-checked measurements, asked precise questions, and rarely strayed into friendly chit-chat. It was a way of working that didn't stand out in a city filled with professionals who kept their personal and professional lives strictly separate. But while nothing in his daily routine hinted at unusual attention, law enforcement had begun watching, slowly, quietly, cautiously. Surveillance in cases this sensitive is never dramatic. There are no flashing lights, no sudden confrontations, no cinematic chases. Instead, it begins with small steps: a car noted on a street, a work schedule observed over time, the rhythm of a person's days and nights quietly recorded. Investigators studied Heuermann's work habits, his routes between Manhattan and Long Island, and the timeline of his movements. They compared them with data points related to the Gilgo Beach case: cell phone interactions, site locations, travel histories, and public records. None of this meant guilt. None of it meant certainty. It simply meant that investigators were looking for overlaps, patterns that might help them understand the puzzle they had been trying to solve for more than a decade. Meanwhile, Heuermann's personal life remained largely ordinary to those around him. His home in Massapequa Park was not the kind of house that drew attention. Its lawn grew a bit wild in the summer. The siding showed signs of age, and the windows were curtained. Neighbors described seeing him carrying tools into the yard, working on small home projects, or loading materials into his vehicle. He rarely lingered for conversation. Interactions were short, polite, and quickly ended. Inside the neighborhood, life went on as usual. Children played in front yards, parents walked their dogs in the evenings, and porch lights flickered on at dusk. Few imagined that this quiet street would one day become a point of national interest. Even fewer imagined that news vans, reporters, and camera crews would one day stand on the same sidewalks where neighbors once casually greeted each other. Back with the task force, Investigators continued studying the case with a level of detail that modern technology finally allowed. Old phone records were re-examined. Patterns of communication were mapped. Locations of devices were reconstructed with tools that didn't exist when the first remains were found near Gilgo Beach. With each new layer of analysis, detectives grew more confident that they were circling a suspect. Not confirmed, not proven, but increasingly likely to be central to understanding the case. Publicly, nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, the investigation was shifting into a new phase. Over time, the task force began piecing together how a suspect might live a life unnoticed while still intersecting with areas relevant to the investigation. They looked at the possibility of someone with a structured work schedule, someone accustomed to long commutes, someone who blended naturally into the dense flow of city life. They studied financial records, personal history, and habits, not to build a narrative, but to understand how someone might avoid scrutiny for so long. For investigators, patience was essential. One misstep could jeopardize years of work. One premature conclusion could damage the integrity of the case. So they continued quietly, building the investigation layer by layer, waiting for the moment when the entire picture would become clear enough to as this chapter closes, the story stands at a delicate point, a point where an ordinary life and an extraordinary investigation move closer than ever. A man with predictable routines continues commuting to Manhattan, drafting plans, attending meetings. And far away in police offices across Long Island, walls lined with evidence begin to narrow toward a single name. In the next chapter, we'll follow how the Gilgo Beach mystery evolved from confusion and frustration into one of the most sophisticated investigations in recent memory, and how a quiet architect found himself at the center of national attention. Chapter 2. The Gilgo Beach mystery begins. Long before investigators ever looked in Rex Heuermann's direction, the story of Gilgo Beach began with a disappearance. It was May of 2010 when a young woman vanished near the barrier islands of Long Island. At first, the search was focused and local, a missing persons case, not a criminal investigation. But as officers combed through the brush and sandy coastline months later, they found something no one expected at a single discovery, followed by another, then another. Within days, what began as a search for one person had turned into something far larger. Bodies were found along Ocean Parkway, scattered within the thick undergrowth, hidden where the dunes met the trees. The first 4 discoveries came quickly, each one deepening the sense of urgency, fear, and confusion. None of the findings offered a clear explanation. There was no obvious pattern, no clear motive, no immediate suspect. For investigators, the only certainty was that the mystery had grown beyond anything they had prepared for. The coastline itself added to the difficulty. Gilgo Beach was isolated, windy, and vast. Storms could shift sand and conceal evidence. The tall beach grass moved like a living wall, hiding anything beneath it. Ocean Parkway was long and exposed, making it a place where anything could disappear without being seen. Detectives walked the area slowly, carefully, repeating searches again and again, as if hoping a different angle of sunlight might reveal something they had missed. The community watched with disbelief. Residents who once saw the beachfront as a quiet escape suddenly found themselves connected to a story that drew national attention. Families along the coast locked their doors more tightly. People who jogged or walked their dog along the trails began avoiding areas near the parkway. Although investigators made no public claims about suspects or motives, fear filled the gaps left by silence. Inside law enforcement offices, the case grew in complexity every day. Detectives from Suffolk County worked alongside state police, FBI specialists, and forensic experts. They compared missing persons cases from multiple states, hoping for overlaps. They built timelines, studied patterns, and considered whether the discoveries pointed to one individual or several. For months, the case felt like trying to navigate a maze with walls that kept shifting. Meanwhile, thousands of tips poured in. Some were sincere and hopeful. Others were based on rumors or misunderstandings. A few were simply impossible to verify. Each one needed to be logged, reviewed, and cross-referenced with existing evidence. Investigators often worked late into the night, faces lit by computer screens, maps on the walls covered in colored pins representing locations, sightings, and clues. Even with immense effort, progress was slow. The case seemed to expand instead of narrow. More remains were discovered. Some could be identified quickly, others took time, and a few would take years. Each new finding added another layer to the investigation, another life that needed to be understood, another family who deserved answers. In the middle of this expanding mystery, a quiet question began to form behind the scenes. Was the suspect someone familiar with the area? Someone who drove along Ocean Parkway often enough to choose the same stretch of coastline? Or someone who simply understood how secluded the area was, how easily the wind and weather could erase traces? These are possibilities, not conclusions. But they guided the early stages of the investigation. Detectives explored connections to local workers, commuters, and people who spent time in the coastal communities. They considered the habits of boaters, fishermen, contractors, and travelers. They reviewed footage from toll booths, security cameras, and traffic points. Though in 2010, digital surveillance was far more limited than it is today, in this early phase, the case was defined by uncertainty. No one knew how long it would take or what direction it would eventually lead. The investigation continued day after day, week after week, as the world watched Long Island with a mixture of fear, fascination, and hope for resolution. Meanwhile, in Massapequa Park, an ordinary life went on quietly. Rex Heuermann continued commuting to Manhattan, drafting plans, meeting clients, and moving through daily routines that looked no different from anyone else's. At the time, he wasn't on any suspect list. He wasn't on investigators' radar. His name appeared nowhere in early reports. The story of the Gilgo Beach investigation was still in its earliest chapters, a chapter filled with questions and silence. Long before the analytics, the surveillance, and the breakthroughs that would come many years later, in these early days, all investigators had were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. But this was only the beginning. And as the case grew colder, quietly, slowly, technology and persistence would begin, reshaping the path forward. As winter settled over Long Island in late 2010, the investigation at Gilgo Beach pressed forward despite cold winds, shifting dunes, and the endless uncertainty that hung over the case. Detectives walked the coastline bundled in thick jackets, scanning every inch of sand as if answers were trapped beneath the surface. For every step they took, waves echoed in the distance, steady, rhythmic, indifferent to the mystery unfolding along the shore. This phase of the investigation was defined by patience. Teams returned to the same areas repeatedly, mapping the land, measuring distances, collecting soil samples, and interviewing residents. Some days yielded promising observations. Others yielded nothing at all. But each piece mattered. Even if investigators didn't yet know how it would weeks turned into months, the story deepened. Identifications were made. Families were notified, and the task force gained a clearer picture of the lives behind the remains discovered near Ocean Parkway. Every identification carried weight, emotional, investigative, and historical. Each name represented a person with a story, relationships, dreams, and pain. And with every name, detectives grew more determined to understand what had happened. Public pressure intensified. The media kept the spotlight on Suffolk County. News vans lined the roads near the beach, capturing footage of search teams combing through thickets of beach grass. Residents followed every update closely, hoping for clarity but fearing what new discoveries might reveal. Even seasoned investigators felt the weight of expectation, but they knew that rushing would only increase the risk of missing something important. During this time, law enforcement agencies expanded their collaboration. Experts from the FBI brought in specialized resources, behavioral analysts, crime scene specialists, digital forensics teams, and geographic profilers. The case file grew thicker with each passing week. Maps were added to walls, timelines stretched across entire boards, and every new fact was layered over the previous ones like translucent sheets, building a story that was difficult to see clearly but impossible to ignore. Still, the puzzle resisted easy answers. The question of whether one individual or multiple people were responsible remained open. Some aspects of the case suggested a single pattern. Others suggested multiple contributors. Even among experts, opinions differed. This ambiguity added to the challenge of building a coherent theory, one that could withstand scrutiny and lead investigators toward meaningful breakthroughs. Yet even as investigators struggled with these complexities, the public began forming its own theories. Online forums filled with speculation. Amateur sleuths analyzed maps and timelines, sometimes helping but often muddying the waters. Detectives monitored these conversations quietly, knowing that while public interest could generate tips, it could also spread misinformation. They focused instead on verifiable details: phone records, documented interactions, witness statements, and physical evidence recovered from the scene. Amid the swirling theories and intense scrutiny, one fact persisted. The person or people responsible had managed to avoid detection for years. Whoever they were, they had moved carefully, left few traces, and understood how easily the environment of Gilgo Beach could conceal clues. This realization pushed investigators to consider a wide range of possibilities. Locals, commuters, travelers, people connected to the area by work, or even those who simply knew its geography well. Throughout all this, life in Massapequa Park continued unquestioned. At the time, Rex Heuermann lived far outside the scope of the investigation. He was, like many others on Long Island, a commuter with a steady job and a routine that left little room for speculation. His name had not surfaced in any reports. No tips pointed in his direction. No witness accounts mentioned him. In these early years, he existed entirely outside the story playing out along the coastline. Meanwhile, investigators faced a more pressing challenge: time. As seasons changed, the landscape of Gilgo Beach changed with them. Storm surges reshaped the dunes. Wind altered the appearance of search sites. Vegetation grew and died back, concealing and revealing different sections of land. Each shift risked affecting crucial evidence. It forced investigators to work steadily, knowing the environment itself was slowly erasing the past. By the end of 2011, the Gilgo Beach case had become one of the most complex investigations in New York's history. The task force had grown. New forensic technologies were being introduced. And even though the case had not yet led to a suspect, detectives refused to let it fade into silence. They knew the truth was still somewhere within the mountains of data they had collected. That IT would just take the right insight or the right technological breakthrough for everything to change. In the next chapter, we follow how the case evolved across the next decade, how new leadership, better tools, and a renewed focus slowly transformed a cold case into one with new momentum. Chapter 3. A case that refused to sleep. As the years passed beyond those first grim discoveries on Gilgo Beach, the investigation became something larger than a police case. It became a presence, a shadow that lingered over Suffolk County. Always there, always unanswered, always waiting. Detectives came and went. Leadership changed. Technology advanced. But the mystery itself held firm, refusing to bend under pressure, refusing to yield a clear direction. There was no single path, no straightforward narrative, no easy line connecting all the names, dates, and places scattered across binders and storage rooms and digital folders on secure servers. It was a case built on fragments, and for a long time, the fragments simply wouldn't align. The public, too, felt this heaviness. Conversations about the case faded from headlines, but never disappeared entirely. People living near Ocean Parkway spoke about it with a mixture of fear and resignation. Some believed the answers were buried beneath the sand. Others believed the truth was farther away, hidden behind closed doors, or perhaps lost in the lack of information from the earliest years. For many, it became part of the cultural memory of Long Island. A story everyone knew, even if no one could finish it. But inside the Suffolk County Police Department, the case file never stopped growing. Evidence logs expanded, boxes multiplied, and digital archives filled with thousands of pages of interviews, subpoenas, phone analyses, and aerial photographs. The detectives assigned to the task force worked with an unusual mixture of patience and frustration. They understood that some breakthroughs happen slowly, others come suddenly, and all require persistence. What made the case even more challenging was how easily the early clues could be interpreted in different ways. Some investigators believed they were dealing with a single offender. Others believed multiple individuals were responsible. Still others suggested the possibility of older and newer cases becoming tangled together over time. There were meetings where theories rose and fell, where evidence was reconstructed and reevaluated, and where detectives tried to see the case with fresh eyes despite years of familiarity. Whiteboards filled with names and timelines were erased and rewritten dozens of times. Investigators traveled across states to follow leads that ended in silence. Agencies exchanged data, hoping that a single overlooked detail might become the turning point. During this period, new technology quietly began reshaping the tools available to law enforcement. Cell tower records were reanalyzed with more precision that DNA testing methods advanced. Digital forensics expanded in ways that would have been unthinkable in the early 2000s. Each advancement breathed a small amount of new life into the investigation. A slightly clearer picture began to emerge. Not a full portrait, but shapes, patterns, outlines. Meanwhile, on Long Island, life continued in steady rhythm. People went to work, schools stayed open, families enjoyed the coastline. Yet beneath the surface, a sense of unfinished business remained. Everyone knew the case wasn't closed. Everyone knew it would return to the forefront someday. They just didn't know when. In the early 2010s, Suffolk County saw a significant shift when leadership changed inside the police department. New officials, new priorities, and new expectations came into focus. Among them was a renewed commitment to the Gilgo Beach investigation. The case had never been ignored, but it now became a central concern again, a priority needing dedicated resources and updated strategies. A task force restructuring breathed fresh air into the investigation. Detectives with specialties in digital forensics, behavioral analysis, financial patterns, and telecommunications were brought in. Old evidence was reassessed with new technology. And perhaps most importantly, outside agencies formed a stronger partnership with Suffolk County, giving the case a far broader reach than before. Still, despite these advancements, progress remained slow. There were days where the entire team felt like they were one step away from something meaningful, a name, a pattern, a connection that would finally pivot the investigation toward closure. And yet, the next morning would bring the same puzzle pieces without any sudden revelation. It was during these long stretches of effort, patience, and silence that the foundation for future breakthroughs was built, even if no one realized it at the time. Every digital record preserved, every interview archived, every piece of old evidence retested, every technology updated. All of it mattered. Years would pass before any of these efforts converged into something that resembled a coherent picture. But the seeds were being planted quietly, methodically, and consistently, the groundwork that would later light the path investigators needed. For now, in these middle years, the Gilgo Beach case existed in a strange state. Not solved, not forgotten, and not stagnant. Just waiting for technology to catch up, for connections to reveal themselves, and for the right people to examine the evidence with the right tools. In part 2 of this chapter, we follow how those tools, insights, and collaborations grew stronger, slowly guiding investigators toward the first meaningful breakthroughs that would eventually reshape the entire case. Rex Heuermann lived in a world where routine was more than comfort. It was camouflage. While others moved through their days with chaos, spontaneity, or little detours, his life ran on rails he rarely stepped off. He woke at the same time each morning, left the same coffee shop with the same order, walked the same route to the subway, and slipped into his Manhattan office as if he were part of the building itself. Employees remembered him as the kind of man who seemed carved out of consistency. Quiet but not cold, private but not rude, just ordinary. And that ordinariness bordered on invisibility. He was simply Rex from the office, The architect who didn't smile much, but always showed up on time. The man who answered questions with just enough detail, but never more. There was no sense of danger around him. No unease. If anything, he came across like someone living a life too rigid to allow anything unpredictable. That was the trick. Predictability became his disguise, a mask of routine. But beneath that structured surface, something else had been building for years, a parallel life, one crafted with patience and secrecy, brick by brick. And the most unsettling part was that no one around him saw it happening at a tea home in Massapequa Park. His neighbors barely remembered his face. They recalled the house, old, worn, a bit out of place among the others that had been repainted and modernized, but not the man inside it. He didn't linger outside. He didn't greet people on the sidewalk. His presence was like a shadow at the edge of their vision, there but not memorable. Even his own family remained insulated from large pieces of his inner world, living lives adjacent to him rather than intertwined with him. People often imagine monsters being loud, dramatic, or chaotic, but the truth, as history has shown again and again, is that many of the most dangerous individuals are the ones who move with quiet precision. Rex lived behind layers, professional, familial, social, and each one was just convincing enough to stop people from looking deeper. What no one realized was that the separation between his worlds wasn't accidental. It was engineered, carefully, methodically. When he was at work, he was thorough and reliable. When he was at home, he was distant but stable. And in the hours between those places, the mask slipped. Behind the normalcy was a man who understood digital spaces, understood what could be traced and what couldn't, and understood how to manipulate the online world just as easily as he manipulated his outer image. He didn't need to live loudly to feel powerful. Control, for him, came in silence. Investigators later noted how he compartmentalized, how he divided his life into clean, sealed rooms, each one holding a version of him that none of the others ever saw. That ability, that mental architecture, didn't appear overnight. It was something he built slowly over years, beginning with small secrets. Things easy to hide, thoughts he could tuck away without consequence, interests he explored only in private, each one adding another layer to the double life he carried quietly, like a locked briefcase he never put down. What made his story disturbing wasn't the violence itself. It was the contrast. The stark, unsettling divide between a man coworkers described as boring and a man investigators would one day call one of the most calculating predators in modern history. He was not impulsive. He was not reckless. He planned everything, and he lived in such a way that the planning didn't look suspicious. It looked like routine. Neighbors spoke later about how they never saw him at block parties, never saw him at the store, never saw him chatting with anyone. Some thought he was shy. Others thought he was simply busy, but nobody thought he was dangerous. You don't assume the quiet man with a briefcase is hiding anything beyond paperwork. That assumption, that human instinct to trust quietness, became his shield that if someone looked at him and saw a father, he stayed a father. That if someone looked at him and saw a diligent architect, he stayed that too, that he was whatever each person needed him to be, while his true self stayed buried beneath layers no one ever peeled back. That IT was that chameleon-like ability, that emotional distance paired with practical intelligence, that made his double life possible and made him invisible for so long. The most unsettling truth is this. Rex Heuermann didn't blend in because he was forgettable. He blended in because he understood exactly what people notice and exactly what they don't. And while the world saw a quiet, slightly awkward professional trying to get through his day, something far more dangerous was living beneath the surface, waiting patiently, hidden in the spaces between his routines. The world would eventually learn what he had been doing in those spaces, but not yet for now. The mask was still intact, and no one even realized he was wearing one. Chapter 4. The Hidden Routines of a Predator. Rex Heuermann lived his days like clockwork, and yet, within those tightly structured hours, he created pockets of space where no one could see him. It wasn't dramatic or suspicious, nothing that would raise eyebrows or invite concern, but small, calculated breaks in routine that appeared ordinary on the surface. He would leave the office for a client meeting when there was no client. He would take longer routes home under the excuse of traffic, even when the roads were clear. He would run errands alone, without explanation, even for things most families handled together. These moments, spaced out and timed perfectly, became the threads of second life woven quietly behind the first. What investigators would later come to understand was that these gaps weren't careless. They were carefully placed windows of opportunity, carved into an otherwise rigid schedule so he could act without drawing attention. And because he lived so predictably on the outside, no one ever stopped to question the unpredictable parts he kept hidden. What made Rex's behavior so effective was how normal it looked from the outside. Everyone has days where they stay late at work. Everyone has moments where they need to run an errand, take time for themselves, or step away for an hour. Everyone has times they don't want to explain. He used these universal human habits like camouflage, stepping into them with the ease of someone who understood how people think. He didn't lie loudly. He lied quietly, in whispers disguised as routines, and those routines allowed him to drift undetected through moments where his life split into two parallel tracks: the public man and the private shadow. Co-workers remembered him as someone who rarely chatted, someone who slipped in and out of the office without lingering, that made his absences blend naturally into the background. No one questioned them because he was never someone people paid close attention to. Even when deadlines were tight or projects were demanding, Rex maintained the same calm, collected energy, as if nothing in his life ever changed. But just beneath that calm surface, his mind operated with the precision of someone constantly managing two worlds. Behind the walls of his Massapequa Park home, Rex's private life grew even more insulated. His family, though close in proximity, often lived parallel to him rather than with him. His long work hours, his solitary hobbies, and his quiet demeanor created a natural barrier, one that made it easy for him to step outside without anyone wondering where he was going or why. He wasn't the man who shared everything. He wasn't the father eager to talk about his day. He wasn't the husband who filled silence with stories. For years, that silence was interpreted as introversion or work stress, or simply the personality of a man more comfortable in routine than conversation. But that silence also gave him space. Space to disappear for short periods without explanation. Space to keep secrets without suspicion. Space to shape a second existence designed with chilling precision. What investigators would later uncover in his digital behavior exposed an entirely different side of him. One that couldn't be seen in person, one that thrived in anonymity. Rex knew how to navigate online spaces the same way he navigated his real life. Quietly, methodically, and with layers of separation. He used multiple devices, multiple accounts, search engines, forums, and platforms under names that could never be traced back to him at a glance. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't reckless. His online world was a labyrinth he built slowly, piece by piece, ensuring that each part of it remained hidden behind digital walls the people closest to him never knew existed. He was a man who spent hours studying the seams between everyday life and secrecy, exploiting them with a patience most people don't recognize until it's too late. Even his physical routines supported his ability to hide. He dressed the same each day, spoke the same each day, moved the same each day, until even the most observant person would stop noticing him. Predictability became his cloak. And while the world focused on the loudest personalities, the most dramatic neighbors, the strangers who acted off, Rex kept himself small, quiet, harmless. His presence in public spaces was so forgettable that investigators later struggled to find people who could recall seeing him regularly, despite the fact that he walked the same paths every single morning. The kind of invisibility isn't accidental. It's engineered. What made this double life so chilling wasn't just the secrecy, it was the patience behind it. Rex didn't act impulsively. He didn't rush. He allowed years to pass between critical moments, building trust with the world while privately cultivating a darker identity no one ever glimpsed. Most people think criminals slip eventually because they're careless. But Rex wasn't careless. He was deliberate. His downfall wouldn't come from recklessness. It would come from something else entirely: something he never expected. But during these years, his mask was airtight, that he also understood the psychology of space, how to distance parts of his life just enough so they never collided. Work and home were separate. Home and private life were separate. Private life and digital world were separate. No one in his life had access to all sides of him. Everyone received a little piece, and he made sure those pieces never touched. That fragmentation was his greatest strength. It kept people from forming a complete picture of him, and it allowed him to slip between roles: father, employee, commuter, stranger, without raising suspicion. At this point in his story, no one around him sensed anything wrong. To neighbors, he was an odd but harmless man. To coworkers, he was the quiet architect. To his family, he was the man who kept to himself. To strangers on the subway, he was just another face in the crowd. And that is what makes this chapter in his life so unnerving. Because while the world saw nothing unusual, Rex Heuermann was refining something beneath the surface. Something private, something controlled, something dangerous. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones who roar, they're the ones who whisper. And at this stage of his life, Rex had mastered the whisper. As the years passed, the precision of Rex Heuermann's double life became almost architectural. Layers of carefully positioned habits designed to hide the darkest parts of himself in plain sight. Every morning, he left his Massapequa Park home with the same slow stride, the same neutral expression, the same steady posture that made him invisible to the neighborhood. The world around him shifted. Children grew older, houses changed owners, jobs evolved, but Rex remained consistent, almost eerily so. He drove the same routes to Manhattan, parked in the same lot, walked the same sidewalks to his office. Even his lunch routines rarely varied. The same delis, the same quiet corners, the same solitary rhythm. To most people, this rigid sameness would seem boring, but for Rex, it was a shield. Predictability masked the unpredictable. Routine disguised the ruptures in his schedule. And because he lived so quietly, no one ever noticed when he carved out small windows of time to slip away. Inside his office, Rex played the role of the meticulous architect with unnerving ease. His desk was stacked with measurements, blueprints, and project notes, each arranged with near-obsessive order. He spoke rarely unless necessary, and even then, kept his voice low, controlled, almost emotionless. Co-workers described him as someone who faded into the background, not abrasive or unpleasant, just forgettable. And forgettable was the perfect disguise. In a bustling city like New York, being memorable is dangerous. Being invisible is power. His silence allowed him to gather more information than he ever shared, absorbing details about people's schedules, habits, and vulnerabilities without offering anything in return. This dynamic became a consistent pattern. Rex took notes on others, but no one knew enough about him to form more than surface-level impressions. Back home, he maintained an atmosphere that kept questions at bay, not by creating drama or enforcing control, but by being selectively present and strategically distant. He offered just enough interaction to avoid suspicion, but never enough to invite curiosity. His hobbies were solitary, his conversations brief, his schedule full of work obligations that no one felt close enough to question. His family learned to navigate around his silence, assuming it was simply part of his personality. In reality, that silence created pockets of unmonitored time where he moved freely between identities without interference. That was his advantage. He didn't need to lie often, because no one expected explanations in the first place. To night, when the house was quiet and his family slept, Rex retreated into the private worlds he built through his computers, his hidden devices, and the digital labyrinths he constructed. Here, he was no longer the quiet architect. He was a collector, gathering information, searching meticulously, studying patterns with an intensity he never displayed publicly. He hid his online behaviors behind VPNs, burner accounts, private browsing, and isolated networks. Layers designed to fragment his digital footprint just as effectively as he fragmented his real-world life. While others browsed casually, Rex navigated the internet like a man exploring hidden rooms in his own mind, each containing secrets he compartmentalized with chilling precision. In public, his demeanor remained so steady that even small anomalies seemed harmless. A late-night drive? He was stressed from work. A sudden walk alone? He needed air. A detour on the way home? Traffic? Or maybe he just preferred the quiet roads. Explanations were simple, believable, and mundane, exactly the kind that never invite suspicion. Even years later, when investigators reconstructed his movements, they realized how expertly these mundane details had been used as camouflage. His life was a canvas painted in ordinary shades, making the darker strokes almost impossible to detect without stepping back and seeing the full image. What Rex understood better than most was that people rarely look for monsters in the everyday. They expect danger to come with warning signs, anger, unpredictability, isolation, or erratic behavior. But Rex presented none of that. He didn't lash out. He didn't cause scenes. He didn't draw attention. He was polite, subdued, consistent, the kind of man who could stand in a room for an hour and leave without anyone remembering he was ever there. That invisibility wasn't accidental. It was learned, practiced, perfected as years passed. This pattern of calculated routine deepened. His life became a series of compartmentalized worlds stacked neatly atop each other. The professional facade, the quiet family man, the isolated wanderer, and the secret predator. None of them overlapped. None of them bled into each other. It was a structure engineered with the same meticulous care he used in his architectural projects. Only this structure wasn't built from concrete or steel. It was built from silence, opportunity, and the trust of those who had no reason to doubt him. He also relied heavily on the natural anonymity of the world around him. The way people in suburbs don't track each other's movements. The way city crowds blur faces. The way routines go unquestioned when they seem stable. He knew how predictable everyone else was, and he used that predictability as leverage. A neighbor walking their dog wouldn't remember what time he left the house. A coworker buried in emails wouldn't notice when he slipped out for an hour. A family accustomed to his quietness wouldn't think twice when he drifted into the garage or stepped outside to make a call. Every oversight by others became a shield for him. And yet, beneath the layers of routine, beneath the stillness of his public life, something cold was always moving in the background. A shadow attached to him like a second self. He carried it through the city streets, through dim parking lots, through highways in the dead of night. No one else could see it, but it shaped his decisions, his opportunities, and the windows of time he carved so carefully. That hidden self thrived not despite his normal life, but because of it. The most unsettling truth about this period is that nothing outwardly dramatic happened. No explosions of violence, no sudden breaks in his facade. It was quiet, controlled, methodical. The calm before a storm he believed no one would ever see coming. And as he moved deeper into this dual existence, the line between who he appeared to be and who he truly was became almost impossible to trace, until investigators would one day unravel the threads he spent years tightening. This was the era where Rex Heuermann perfected his invisibility, and invisible men are the hardest to catch. Chapter 5, Patterns Beneath the Surface, as investigators would later piece together. The period leading into Rex Heuermann's later years became defined not by dramatic events, but by subtle behaviors. Patterns hiding within patterns. Choices so ordinary they slipped unnoticed through the lives of everyone around him. This chapter in his life was shaped by the smooth blending of routine, stability, and small, calculated deviations that only became clear in hindsight. To understand how he managed to remain invisible for so long, you first have to understand how carefully he balanced predictability with quiet opportunism. Through his daily life in Manhattan, Rex became a creature of habit, the kind of man who thrived on structure. Predictable subway routes, predictable work hours, predictable meals, predictable silence. Yet within that predictability, there were faint distortions, brief stops, unusual detours, small pockets of unaccounted time that didn't alarm anyone but later stood out like tiny fractures in glass once investigators knew where to look. His talent wasn't in creating a perfect cover. It was in creating a life so unremarkably stable that the imperfections were invisible at first glance to co-workers. He was the man whose footsteps echoed down the hallway at the same hour each morning. He arrived carrying the same worn briefcase, wearing the same calm, almost stiff expression, radiating the energy of someone who preferred order over conversation. He answered questions with precision, never oversharing, never inviting deeper familiarity. People trusted him not because he was warm or charismatic, but because he was consistent, and consistency can feel like reliability. Over the years, he built a reputation for being methodical, dependable, and quietly intelligent. But the people around him didn't realize that this outward steadiness gave him a perfect shield. Any brief absence was attributed to work demands. Any change in schedule was assumed to be tied to a project. No one questioned small gaps in his day because he didn't create the kind of presence that drew questions in the first place. For Rex, invisibility wasn't just a social accident. It was a strategic advantage. As his architectural career matured, so did the ways he concealed the parts of himself no one saw. He developed an instinct for reading people, not just clients, but strangers in passing, coworkers, cashiers, neighbors, observing how easily people accepted surface-level behavior as truth. He understood that if you acted like a man with nothing to hide, most people would never look for anything deeper. That was the psychology he leaned on. The world rarely suspects those who appear stable. And Rex made sure stable was the first word people associated with him. Even in moments when he displayed irritation, a gruff comment, a tightened jaw, a glance that lingered too long, he always followed it with quietness, as if retreating back into the role he'd built. People dismissed his oddities as quirks, not warnings. Meanwhile, life at home continued in a similarly contained rhythm. His family saw the routine-driven man he wanted them to see, the one focused on work, responsibilities, and a narrow family circle that functioned without much emotional depth. He wasn't explosive or unpredictable. He was distant in a way that felt habitual, not alarming. And because his home environment was shaped around this distance, he could slip in and out of roles without creating ripples. At times, he would linger in the garage longer than necessary. At other times, he would take late-night drives framed as clearing his head. But none of these behaviors stood out because they were subtle, consistent, and ultimately absorbed into the quiet nature of his personality. The absence of chaos became its own disguise. Yet beneath the calm surface of his daily life, something else was forming, a pattern of compartmentalization that grew sharper, more controlled, and more strategic with each passing year. Rex became deeply reliant on separation. Work never blended with home. Home never blended with personal hobbies. Personal hobbies never blended with his private digital world. Each part of his life existed like sealed rooms in a house designed to confuse anyone who tried to map its layout. This separation wasn't accidental. It was the architecture of a man who understood that the less people saw, the less they questioned. Even those closest to him only received fragments of who he was, and no one ever saw the whole picture. The truth is that during this stage of his life, Rex wasn't necessarily planning for the future as much as he was perfecting the present. His routines were refined to the point where any slight break in behavior, any strange choice, became nearly impossible to detect because they were buried inside thousands of moments that looked completely normal. He could disappear for short periods because he had built a life where no one tracked him closely. He could switch between roles because he ensured the people around him never overlapped in ways that would expose inconsistencies. Even his digital patterns, the searching, the browsing, the isolating of devices, were done with calculated separation, as if he were running multiple versions of himself behind closed doors. Those who encountered him in passing. The barista at a corner shop, the security guard at his building, the neighbor walking a dog. He was just another middle-aged man with a heavy walk and quiet demeanor. But that anonymity was his greatest asset. He moved through the world like a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And the more he practiced it, the more natural it became. The rhythms of his concealed life grew so refined that even those rare moments of deviation folded seamlessly into the larger picture of who he appeared to be. Years later, when investigators would map out his movements, they would discover something chilling. The patterns were there all along. The late-night absences, the unaccounted drives, the isolated digital behaviors, the quiet detours carved between long stretches of normality. The structure of his life hadn't hidden these things. It had disguised them by overwhelming them with routine. Like a puzzle made of identical pieces, the dangerous parts blended into the harmless ones until the entire picture became almost impossible to decipher. This chapter of his life wasn't loud, dramatic, or chaotic. It was slow, quiet, and deeply calculated. The period where Rex Heuermann perfected the art of living behind a mask so ordinary that no one thought to lift it. And in that stillness, in that carefully maintained normality, the foundations of everything that would follow were quietly being built. The deeper investigators later dug into Rex Heuermann's life, the more they realized that small, seemingly harmless moments formed the backbone of his ability to operate without detection. These weren't flashes of suspicious behavior or dramatic deviations from routine. They were quiet inconsistencies that blended so naturally into the fabric of his daily life that no one ever recognized them for what they truly were. In retrospect, they formed a mosaic of hidden behavior, but at the time, they looked like nothing at all. For instance, Rex often stayed late at the office, not because anyone demanded it, but because staying late provided him with a plausible alibi for disappearing into private pockets of time. Sometimes he would return home long after the last train rush had ended, carrying the same neutral expression he wore every day. If asked, he would mention a project, a client request, a traffic delay, explanations so ordinary that no one pushed further. It wasn't that he crafted elaborate lies. It was that he chose excuses so mundane, so familiar, that questioning them felt unnecessary. There were also the errands, random, oddly timed, and always handled alone. He would leave the house at unusual hours, claiming he needed something specific from a store, despite the fact that the same items could have waited until morning. These outings weren't dramatic enough to concern anyone, just slightly out of rhythm. They slipped under the radar, because the world is full of people who run late-night errands without reason. But each unexplained moment became another blank space in the timeline of his life. Another gap no one filled in until investigators retraced his steps years later. What made these moments so effective was that they were never patterned closely enough to seem suspicious. They were spaced out, irregular, wrapped in silence. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical enough to know that if these absences were occasional, they would be dismissed as nothing more than the quirks of a man who kept to himself in the digital realm. The patterns were even more fragmented. Rex compartmentalized his online life with surgical precision. He used isolated devices, avoided connecting personal accounts to questionable searches, and moved between browsers as if he were leaving no footprints behind. Investigators eventually found that he used multiple internet identities the way some people flip through television channels, switching fluidly, keeping each persona contained within its own boundary. But these actions didn't stand out to anyone at the time because no one close to him had access to his digital habits. He kept his personal computers private, his devices guarded, and his online presence minimized. The less people knew, the less they questioned. And the truth is, most families don't track each other's internet activity. Most coworkers don't monitor each other's hobbies. Most neighbors don't check browser histories. He relied on that natural social distance to move through the online world unnoticed. Even in his physical habits, small red flags were hidden inside routine. Rex often took long drives without clear destinations, drives he excused as clearing his head or avoiding stress. Sometimes he would park at scenic overlooks or quiet roadsides, sitting in silence before returning home. These behaviors weren't unusual enough to trigger alarm, especially for a man with a demanding job and a naturally introverted personality. But when investigators later reviewed traffic cameras, toll data, and witness routes, they saw something different. Patterns in the way he navigated the city, patterns in how he selected roads, patterns in when he chose to be alone. What appear to be harmless escapes were, in hindsight, calculated choices that allowed him to move between his public persona and the private shadow self he protected so fiercely. Even his home life offered moments that didn't add up. He would retreat to the garage for long stretches, claiming to be organizing tools or working on minor repairs, yet the garage never seemed to change. He would take late-night showers, not after workouts or long days, but at strange hours that didn't match his schedule. He would spend time in the basement under the pretense of cleaning or sorting paperwork, though no one ever saw significant progress. Again, none of these details were alarming on their own. They were subtle, understated behaviors that families across the world exhibit without a second thought. But in Rex's case, they were pieces of a larger pattern, controlled isolation, and then there were the strange breaks in his emotional rhythms. Rex wasn't a man known for displays of affection or vulnerability, but even within his guarded personality, there were moments when he seemed particularly detached, staring at nothing, withdrawing suddenly, or losing himself in silence, as if mentally stepping into another world entirely. To those around him, these moments were dismissed as stress, introversion, fatigue. But in hindsight, investigators recognized them as shifts in mindset, transitions between the faces he showed the world and the identity he kept hidden. It was as if his mind moved through different chambers, each one locked away from the others. What made this chapter so chilling wasn't the presence of danger. It was the absence of it. He didn't explode with anger. He didn't behave erratically. He didn't leave obvious signs. Instead, he functioned like a man who understood human perception intimately, someone who knew exactly how much to reveal and how much to hide. The gaps in his schedule were small, the deviations quiet, the inconsistencies gentle. They were shadows that only existed when cast against the full picture of his life, a picture that no one had until everything began to unravel years later. This phase of Rex Heuermann's life was the perfect storm of invisibility, subtle absences, unnoticed digital habits, unremarkable behaviors, and a world too busy and too trusting to connect the dots. He didn't need dramatic cover stories or complex lies. All he needed was silence. And silence, when woven carefully enough, becomes a mask stronger than anything else. This was the era where his hidden routines solidified into something far more calculated, than a life that appeared unchanged, even as the truth beneath it grew darker and more precise. Chapter 6. The Unseen Threshold. By the time Rex Heuermann entered the next phase of his life, the world around him had already accepted his identity without question. He was the quiet Long Island commuter, the meticulous architect, the man who blended into conference rooms and construction sites alike. But beneath that normality, there was a shift, subtle, almost undetectable, a new threshold forming in the private layers of his life. This wasn't a dramatic turn or a sudden unraveling. It was the slow tightening of a pattern he had been shaping for years. His routines became sharper. His silences grew heavier, and the spaces between his public life and his hidden one began to stretch into something deeper and more deliberate. The people around him didn't notice the change because it wasn't loud. It didn't come with conflict or instability. It was quiet, methodical, almost clinical, the kind of transformation that occurs when a person grows more confident in the secrets they're keeping. Rex had mastered invisibility. Now, he was refining control point. One of the most important developments during this period was how he began using his professional skills not only for work, but for structure, mental architecture, emotional boundaries, private systems of compartmentalization. Architecture requires precision, planning, measuring, studying constraints, anticipating how small weaknesses can collapse an entire structure. Rex applied the same logic to his life. He organized his worlds like separate rooms in a blueprint, each sealed from the others, each containing pieces of who he was that never touched. At work, he was the competent designer. At home, the quiet family man. In his private life, he was something else entirely, something he kept behind walls made of routine and silence. And because those walls were engineered so carefully, they held for years without anyone noticing the pressure building behind them. Another shift came in how Rex observed the world. His awareness grew sharper, like he was studying not just people, but the gaps in their attention. He learned when coworkers were distracted, when neighbors were preoccupied, when family members were asleep or absorbed in their own responsibilities. He watched the rhythms of others the way a hunter studies the environment, not out of curiosity, but calculation. The more he understood about when the world wasn't looking, the easier it became for him to slip into the spaces between their awareness. This wasn't stalking or lurking, it was timing, precision, psychology. He didn't rely on luck. He relied on the natural blindness of routine, the human tendency to stop noticing things we see every day. Privately, his interest in control deepened, not through violence or outward displays of dominance, but through careful manipulation of time, space, and perception. He maintained a neutral tone in conversations, never revealing too much. He used politeness as a shield, efficiency as a distraction, and silence as a tool. When he spoke, he sounded authoritative. When he didn't speak, he disappeared. That duality made him uniquely difficult to read. A man who could stand in front of you without leaving an impression, yet also someone who could assert himself when he needed to mask the parts of him he didn't want others to see. It was this balance that allowed him to move between identities seamlessly, occupying each role with enough competence that no one questioned the others. Meanwhile, his private world expanded in ways no one witnessed. Rex developed a layered relationship with secrecy. Not secrecy born of fear, but secrecy born of control. He began segmenting his personal activities into even smaller compartments. Searches were done on separate devices. Drives were taken with no predictable pattern. Errands became more spaced out, more strategically timed. He created routines inside routines, like hidden hallways branching off his otherwise simple schedule. These branches grew so naturally that even years later, investigators struggled to distinguish which parts of his life were ordinary and which were engineered for concealment. That level of planning didn't come from impulse. It came from years of refinement. At home, the boundary between him and the rest of the household widened, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in a gradual distancing. He became more solitary, more inward, spending longer periods in the garage, the basement, or isolated corners of the house. His family, accustomed to his quietness, accepted it as part of who he was. They didn't see this withdrawal as suspicious because it had been unfolding slowly over years, becoming just another part of the rhythm of the home. But for Rex, these private pockets were essential. They were the protected spaces where his hidden life could exist without interruption. Publicly, he maintained a reputation for being diligent and competent. He attended meetings, completed projects, fulfilled responsibilities, all while carrying a private identity no one could see. This dual existence required immense mental discipline, and the more he practiced it, the more natural it became. He moved through the world like a man who had rehearsed every step, every expression, every explanation. And because he left so few emotional footprints, people never formed deep memories of him. That lack of emotional imprint was not an accident. It was a consequence of how he crafted his interactions. Minimal, efficient, forgettable. But the most unsettling part of this era was how comfortable Rex became in balancing these parallel lives. Maintaining secrecy no longer required effort. It became woven into his psychology. His confidence grew. His caution remained. His ability to navigate between his roles deepened. It was during this period that the foundation of everything that would eventually surface years later was quietly solidified, not through obvious actions, but through carefully maintained invisibility. This was the threshold, the point where the man he appeared to be and the man he truly was began to move in perfect parallel, never touching, never colliding, but coexisting so seamlessly that even those closest to him never realized they were living beside a divided soul. And in that quiet divide, The danger growing beneath the surface remained completely unseen. As Rex Heuermann settled deeper into this split existence, the contrast between his outer world and his inner one grew wider, yet went entirely unnoticed by those around him. This phase of his life was defined by an eerie calm, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from control. Every aspect of his life moved like clockwork, each day mirroring the last, creating a rhythm so stable that no one suspected anything beneath it. Yet within that rhythm, subtle changes were taking shape, changes that, at the time, looked harmless but would later be recognized as the quiet strengthening of his private shadow life. He wasn't unraveling, he was refining. He wasn't losing control, he was cultivating it. And that distinction is what made this chapter so quietly dangerous. The more he perfected his routines, the more confident he became in maintaining the hidden world behind them, until secrecy wasn't something he protected, but something he lived inside. His workplace remained the perfect sanctuary for invisibility. In the bustle of Manhattan, where thousands of workers flowed in and out of buildings every day, Rex was just another face in the crowd. Tall, heavy-set, slow-moving, but otherwise forgettable. Co-workers saw him as diligent, smart, and somewhat socially awkward, but never troubling or threatening. He kept his interactions minimal, focusing intensely on tasks while offering only brief nods or brief, clipped sentences when approached. This minimalism worked in his favor. People remembered his presence, but not his actions. They knew he was there, but couldn't recall where he had been at specific times. And because he didn't insert himself into social circles, no one noticed when his absences stretched a little too long or when he returned to the office appearing slightly distracted. To them, he was simply the quiet architect with a lot on his plate. In reality, his silence was part of a much larger system, a deliberately curated presence designed to minimize curiosity. At home, the divide between Rex and the rest of the household became even more pronounced. His days were structured around brief, surface-level exchanges, a question about dinner, a comment about work, a small gesture of routine that signaled normalcy. But emotionally, he was elsewhere. He occupied the home like someone passing through rather than living inside it. His family became accustomed to this distance, interpreting it as the nature of a private, introverted man rather than a warning sign. And because he wasn't volatile or disruptive, his detachment never seemed concerning. The calm he displayed wasn't peaceful, but stagnant, the stillness of someone managing his inner life behind carefully constructed walls. His home was a stage. His real life unfolded in the hidden corridors he created outside. At point one of the clear signs of the growing divide was how he managed time. Rex understood, better than most, that time itself could be manipulated, bent, and shaped to hide entire parts of his existence. He stretched minutes into opportunities and turned hours into alibis. He intentionally created windows of time that appeared mundane enough to be overlooked, but were large enough for him to drift into his private world. A 20-minute stop on the way home, a detour to avoid traffic, an extra hour at the office to finish a project. None of these actions were suspicious in isolation, but together, they formed an intricate lattice of concealed movement. Investigators would later realize that these windows aligned with moments where Rex's private behaviors intensified. Late-night drives, isolated errands, unexplained detours, and digital activity conducted far from prying eyes. He didn't rely on spontaneity. He relied on timing. His digital behavior also evolved during this period. He became more strategic, more careful, and more precise with his online presence. Devices were rotated. Searches were fragmented. Accounts were compartmentalized. He avoided overlap in his digital footprints the same way he avoided overlap in his personal relationships. He created isolated pockets of online activity that couldn't be traced back to his daily life without deep forensic reconstruction. This wasn't the behavior of someone acting on impulse. It was the behavior of someone who understood that secrecy wasn't about hiding everything, but about hiding the right things in the right places. The most unsettling part of this era wasn't what Rex did, but what he didn't do. He didn't draw attention. He didn't cause conflict. He didn't behave recklessly. He didn't leave emotional debris behind. His life looked stable from every angle. A stable job, a stable marriage, a stable home. But stability can be a mask when worn by the wrong person. And Rex wore it masterfully. The calm he projected became the perfect disguise for the storm brewing beneath his surface. He lived inside, that calm like a man living inside a wall he built himself, safe, concealed, and entirely separate from the world around him. Be why this point. Rex had fully mastered the art of blending into his environment. He didn't need to deceive people actively. He simply needed to continue appearing ordinary. People notice chaos. They don't notice stillness. And Rex was still, unsettlingly so. His invisibility wasn't a failure of those around him. It was a strategy he perfected day by day, year by year, until the hidden parts of his life were so deeply buried that even those closest to him couldn't see the truth. This was the calm before everything began to shift, the period where the hidden architecture of Rex Heuermann's life reached its peak. A life so carefully designed, so meticulously maintained, that the cracks forming beneath it remained invisible until the day the entire structure finally began to collapse. Chapter 7. When the two worlds begin to drift as Rex Heuermann moved deeper into the routine that defined his adult life, an almost imperceptible shift began to take place. A widening gap between the man he presented to the world and the man he became when no one was watching. For years, those two identities ran parallel without colliding. But during this period, the worlds began to drift apart, no longer running smoothly side by side, but slowly bending away from each other. Not enough to draw suspicion, not enough to spark alarm, just enough that the hidden parts of Rex's life began to demand more space, more time, more mental energy, and he adjusted his outer life to accommodate those demands without anyone realizing. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an expansion. His private world was growing, and the quiet persona he presented publicly shifted as he made room for the parts of himself he kept buried. He became more deliberate with isolation, carving out pockets of solitude that appeared reasonable on the surface. Late-night drives framed as clearing his head, weekend errands that seemed harmless, extended periods in the garage under the excuse of sorting tools or fixing minor projects. These moments grew longer in duration, yet remained subtle enough to blend into the rhythms of daily life. People around him didn't question the time he spent alone because it aligned with his personality. He wasn't a man known for long conversations or emotional outpourings. He was reserved by nature. So when he disappeared for an hour or two at odd times, it didn't stand out as anything unusual. But in reality, these moments weren't just about solitude. They were about creating mental distance between his two worlds, allowing him to retreat into the identity no one else could see. His work life remained steady, but coworkers began noticing small changes. Not dramatic ones, just faint shifts in energy. Some recalled that he looked more distracted on certain days, more drained on others. Not in a disheveled or alarming way, but in a way that suggested he was carrying something internally. Yet because he still performed well, still met deadlines, still followed procedures, these observations faded quickly. In a busy office, minor fatigue doesn't stand out. People chalk it up to stress, workload, or personal matters, all common explanations. And Rex knew this. He relied on the fact that adults rarely probe into each other's emotional states. The less he revealed, the more room he had to disappear into his private world without interference. There were also subtle behavioral changes at home, changes that blended seamlessly into the rhythm of a family accustomed to his quiet presence. He became even more withdrawn, speaking less, offering fewer details about his day, providing explanations that were shorter and less revealing. He wasn't secretive in a dramatic way. He simply gave less of himself with each passing year. Conversations grew thinner. Interactions became more transactional. He floated through the home like a man carrying invisible weight, yet never enough to concern those who lived with him. His detachment looked like exhaustion. His silence looked like routine. His distance looked like the natural progression of a man buried in work and responsibility. His digital behavior, however, grew more intricate. He added more layers of separation, additional devices, new accounts, private browsing techniques, isolated drives. He didn't simply hide his tracks, he scattered them. He created a digital environment where every activity existed in its own sealed space, with nothing connecting one identity to another. He became more strategic in when and where he conducted certain searches, choosing times when he would be completely undisturbed. He timed his digital activity around the movements of others, late at night, early in the morning, or during moments when the house fell into quiet pockets of routine. This wasn't paranoia, it was precision. A man who understood how easily digital trails could expose him took steps to hide those trails long before anyone thought to look. Meanwhile, the small inconsistencies in his daily life, the subtle shifts in schedule, the unexplained gaps in time, the isolated habits, all remained hidden under the weight of his ordinary existence. The world sees what it expects to see, and because Rex had built years of predictability, the world expected nothing but more of the same. His absences were dismissed. His distance was normalized. His quietness was accepted. Even when minor red flags appeared, they blended into the background of a man who had never drawn attention. He wasn't unpredictable. He wasn't volatile. He wasn't chaotic. And in a society conditioned to look for danger in extremes, his mild, steady demeanor became the perfect disguise. What made this period so crucial and so chilling is that the widening gap between his two lives didn't create cracks. It created confidence. The more he hid, the more secure he felt in his ability to hide. The more his private world expanded, the more convinced he became that it would remain untouched. He had spent years building a life that allowed secrecy to flourish unnoticed, and now those years seemed to be paying off. He moved through his days with a sense of quiet assurance, as if fully aware that no one in his orbit had reason to question him. And the truth is, they didn't. His invisibility wasn't just intact, it was thriving. This was the stage where the mask tightened, where the distance between who he seemed to be and who he truly was became too wide for anyone to cross. He was living two lives, one seen, one hidden, and both were functioning exactly as he intended. The drift had begun, and once the worlds began to separate, neither would ever move back into alignment again. By this point, Rex Heuermann's double existence had evolved into a system. Not a collection of coincidences, but a structured design that he maintained with the discipline of an architect. Everything in his life, from his schedule to his words, had been drafted like blueprints, measured, deliberate, and precise. The longer he kept the balance between his two worlds, the more control he felt over both. His behavior wasn't chaotic or impulsive. It was methodical. He didn't act on whims. He followed plans, adjusted routines, and studied outcomes. In that structure, he found security. The same attention to detail that made him an efficient professional was now being used to build a psychological fortress around his secrets that Rex's control extended beyond action. It was embedded in how he thought, how he planned, and how he viewed the world. He didn't rely on improvisation. He relied on anticipation. He mapped out possibilities the same way he mapped out projects, accounting for risk, distraction, and exposure. In every scenario, he asked himself the same silent question: what will this look like from the outside? He had become an expert at perception management. Every step of his public life was designed to maintain the illusion of ordinariness. He cultivated predictability like armor, knowing that the more consistent his image appeared, the less anyone would look beyond it. This habit of control carried into every detail of his routine. He made sure his presence was always accounted for, even in moments when his actions were separate from that presence. He maintained a reputation as reliable and hardworking, because reliability builds invisibility. He understood how easily a dependable person disappears into the fabric of society. The more dependable he appeared, the easier it became to create unobserved spaces in his life, spaces that no one thought to question. His movements were simple but deliberate: drive the same routes, park in the same places, stick to the same routines. Normalcy became camouflage. Predictability became freedom. The power of control shaped not only his actions but also his emotions. Rex didn't express extremes. He wasn't known to lose his temper or show vulnerability. He stayed within a narrow emotional range, calm, serious, distant. That restraint became another form of invisibility. People trust calmness. They interpret stillness as safety. And so, he wore calmness like a uniform. Even when pressure built around him, he showed no visible signs. That composure wasn't peace, it was suppression. Every emotion was tucked away in a mental archive that he accessed only in private. He didn't explode, he compartmentalized. He didn't confess, he analyzed. The control extended inward, forming an inner silence that matched the outer one, that yet this silence came with consequences. Control, after all, requires effort, and effort leaves traces. There were nights when Rex withdrew more deeply into himself, the strain of maintaining both worlds beginning to show in the smallest cracks. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle patterns of exhaustion. Longer silences at dinner, slower responses to questions, brief flickers of distraction when someone spoke to him. He wasn't unraveling. Not yet, but maintaining his facade demanded constant calculation, and calculation is tiring. The more carefully he built his walls, the heavier they became to hold. Outside his home, those who interacted with Rex occasionally caught glimpses of his detachment. A coworker might describe him as intense, or hard to read, or simply a little off. But in a busy world full of personalities, eccentricity doesn't stand out. People often mistake distance for focus, awkwardness for shyness, quietness for humility. Rex benefited from that human tendency to fill in blanks with kindness. The truth was simpler. He had learned how to give people just enough warmth to seem polite, and just enough distance to stay unreadable. During this phase, his control deepened to the point where even small, ordinary events, a missed call, an unexpected visitor, a change in schedule, required internal recalibration. He built contingency plans for everything. If someone came home early, he had an explanation. If a neighbor asked a question, he had a story. If his phone rang at the wrong time, he had a reason. He was, in essence, managing a theater production in which every scene of his life had to play perfectly for the illusion to remain intact. And for years it did. That level of discipline might have been admirable if it hadn't been used to sustain deception. But within every structure, no matter how carefully designed, there's always a weak point, a load-bearing beam that, if cracked, can bring the entire design down. For Rex, that weak point wasn't exposure from others. It was overconfidence. The longer he went unnoticed, the more convinced he became that he never would be. And confidence, when left unchecked, turns into assumption. He assumed his systems would hold. He assumed his lies were airtight. He assumed that ordinary people, co-workers, neighbors, investigators, would always see him as harmless. That assumption would become the first silent fracture in his otherwise flawless design. As time passed, the fractures multiplied. A conversation recalled by a neighbor that didn't sound right. A digital trace that didn't disappear as cleanly as he thought. An alibi that placed him too close to questions he couldn't easily answer. None of these cracks were large enough to break through yet, but the structure was starting to shift, ever so slightly, beneath the weight of the secrets it carried. And just like any structure under stress, it wouldn't collapse suddenly. It would fail slowly, silently, one hidden fault at a time. The calm before the storm wasn't about peace, it was about imbalance. Rex had built an architecture of control so perfect that even he believed it was unbreakable. But like any man who mistakes silence for safety, he forgot that cracks never start with noise. They start with pressure. And in the quiet of his meticulously built world, that pressure had already begun to rise. Chapter 8. Shifts in the silence. The structure of Rex Heuermann's life had always depended on routine, on a silent rhythm that kept every part of his world separated and controlled. But as time moved forward, the rhythm began shifting in ways even he didn't immediately recognize. It started with small things, moments so subtle that an outsider would never notice, But to a man who lived by precision, they were disruptions he had to fold into his calculations. A deadline moved unexpectedly, a client meeting added without warning, a family moment interrupted by a call he hadn't anticipated. These weren't crises, not yet, but they were signals. The quiet world he'd relied on was changing its tempo. With each shift, he adjusted seamlessly, never outwardly reacting, but internally taking note of how often he found himself navigating variables he hadn't planned for. For a man who lived in compartmentalization, unpredictability was a threat, and threats, no matter how small, required strategy. People around him didn't see the shifts the way he did. To them, Rex was the same steady, stone-faced figure they had always known. The reliable contractor who showed up early, the quiet man who avoided conflict, the neighbor who didn't say much but never caused trouble. Even in moments when he was tired or withdrawn, people interpreted it through their own filters. He must be exhausted from work, they assumed, or stressed about a project, or simply one of those introverted men who kept to himself. They didn't see the hours he spent recalibrating his life internally, figuring out how to absorb disruptions without letting them bleed into the parts of himself he kept hidden. He had lived so long with a dual existence that the ability to maintain composure had become second nature. But below the stillness, something else had begun to form. Not panic, not fear, but a faint pressure, like a tightness in a beam supporting too much weight. Part of that pressure came from digital footprints, something that hadn't been a significant factor in the earlier years of his life, but had become unavoidable as the world changed. Technology wasn't just a tool anymore. It was an archive, a mirror, and sometimes a trap. Every search, every message, every call left a trace. And while Rex was methodical, he was not immune to the realities of a world that recorded everything. There were moments when he hovered over a screen longer than he should have, hesitating not because he felt guilt, but because he understood the permanence of data in a way most people didn't. He wasn't careless, but he was human, and humans make small missteps, small repeats, small patterns that can be seen when the wrong set of eyes starts looking. For years, no one had those eyes on him, but time was shifting, and with it, scrutiny. Yet the greatest shifts weren't digital. They were social. Communities change, people move, neighbors become more aware, and the atmosphere of a place evolves over time. The very thing that once protected him, anonymity in a dense, busy environment, was beginning to thin. Cameras appeared on doorbells. Phones recorded everything. People were more connected, more observant, more attuned to minor disturbances. A strange car on a street was no longer invisible. A late-night noise was no longer brushed off. The world was getting smaller in ways that had nothing to do with geography. And though Rex didn't fear people, he did understand data. And data, aggregated across a community, could reveal patterns he didn't want revealed at home. The shifts were quieter, but just as real. A missed family event here, a forgotten detail there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that alarmed anyone, but things that chipped at the edges of the structure he had built. Family members might have noticed his distraction, but in the way one dismisses familiarity. He was busy, he was tired, he had a lot going on. They didn't understand how much he depended on smoothness, on predictability, on the absence of questions. Questions, even innocent ones, forced him to adjust the narrative, and adjusting the narrative required precision. A man who lives through compartments cannot afford improvisation. But the most important shift, the one he barely recognized, was happening inside him. Years of control create a kind of confidence that borders on invincibility, and that confidence softens vigilance. The longer he went unseen, the more he began to assume he always would be. That assumption wasn't arrogance, it was adaptation. When a person builds a world that survives unchallenged for decades, they begin to believe the world is unchallengeable. Rex wasn't reckless. He was conditioned. Conditioned to believe that his routines were strong enough, his boundaries impermeable, his image airtight. But cracks never appear dramatically at first. They appear as faint lines under pressure, invisible until the moment they're not. And beneath it all, the quiet landscape of Long Island, with its suburban stillness, its predictable seasons, its neat rows of homes started to shift too. Not because of anything he did, but because communities evolve. And when communities evolve, they create new eyes, new systems, new intersections of information. The surroundings that had once concealed him perfectly were beginning to change shape. Not enough to expose him yet, but enough to alter the background against which he had built his life to be by the time these shifts began aligning. Rex hadn't lost control, but he no longer owned it fully. The world around him was becoming sharper, more connected, more curious. And even though he remained calm, composed, and disciplined on the surface, the architecture he lived within was beginning to carry new tension in its beams. He just didn't know the structure was already leaning. As the subtle fractures in Rex Heuermann's carefully structured world widened, the forces gathering around him took shape in ways he couldn't see, forming slowly, almost invisibly, the way fog gathers across a coastline before anyone realizes the visibility has changed. These forces weren't dramatic police stings or sudden accusations. They were simple, ordinary interactions that began stacking like pages in a file no one had created yet. A coworker noticing he seemed tired on a particular week. A neighbor registering an unusual schedule shift. A digital record storing a timestamp he had forgotten. Each detail by itself meant nothing. But in the age of interconnectedness, the ordinary becomes extraordinary when viewed in hindsight. At the time, they were nothing more than flickers, stray impressions absorbed into the flow of daily life. But they were forming a quiet gravity around him, a pressure he didn't feel because it was still too soft, too spread out, too early. The individuals around him remained unaware of how their own lives were feeding the growing web of awareness. Detectives working unrelated cases began noticing overlaps that made them pause. Civic workers reviewing records stumbled over anomalies they chalked up to clerical errors. Even strangers who navigated the same public spaces as Rex contributed without knowing. A glance captured by a new security camera, a license plate logged automatically by a passing patrol car, a phone tower ping recorded in an unrelated data sweep. None of these points of information were targeted at him. They were simply artifacts of modern life, and like grains of sand, they seemed insignificant until enough gathered to shift the landscape entirely. Meanwhile, Rex continued moving through his routine with the same measured steps, unaware that the world was evolving into something far less forgiving to people who relied on invisibility. Yet the most powerful shift wasn't technological, it was psychological. Communities that once minded their own business began paying attention in subtle, collective ways. The neighborhood that had previously dismissed oddities now found itself unconsciously cataloging them. Not because anyone suspected Rex in particular, but because the social atmosphere of an area changes as generations rotate. Younger families moved in, bringing with them a culture of caution shaped by true crime awareness and digital vigilance. Streetlights were updated. Surveillance became normal. Conversations drifted towards safety, suspicious vehicles, and unusual noises at night. These were shifts caused not by him, but around him, and while none of it was directed his way, all of it changed the backdrop that had once shielded him effortlessly. Inside his home, the changes took on a quieter tone. Delays, small misunderstandings, routines shifting without explanation. A missed message leading to a repeated question. A canceled appointment creating a ripple that altered the timing of an evening. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual, but enough to pull Rex slightly off the center of his own clockwork rhythm. He adjusted, as he always did, but these adjustments required more mental energy than before. And with every slight disruption, he had to recalibrate the unspoken boundaries that separated the public man from the private one. Maintaining the dual nature of his life had once been effortless, almost instinctive, but now required sharper focus because the territory around him was becoming less predictable, more observant, more informed. Meanwhile, the investigative world itself was evolving. Cold case protocols were becoming more sophisticated. Digital forensics was rapidly advancing. Younger detectives, raised in the era of technology, had a different instinct for patterns, an instinct that older methods could never fully replace. Across county lines, across databases, across time, tiny clues were being stored in corners of systems that Rex didn't know existed. Some were automated logs, some were digital artifacts, some were handwritten notes that ended up scanned into searchable archives. At that time, none were being used against him, but they were waiting, accumulating quietly like dust in an attic, invisible until light eventually hits just right. The community around him continued its daily life in peaceful rhythms. School buses rolling through neighborhoods, families hosting backyard gatherings, commuters rushing toward trains, grocery store aisles filling with routine chatter. And threading through all of it, Rex appeared as he always had. The large, quiet man who kept to himself. No one suspected him. No one confronted him. No one saw darkness in him. This was the paradox that maintained the illusion of safety. People believed danger had a certain appearance, and he didn't match it. Even as minor shifts in his behavior could have been noticed, a slight distraction, an unusual purchase, a late-night drive. No one interpreted these through the lens of suspicion. They simply saw a man living his life, even if the edges were fraying. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves even when no one is looking for them intentionally. It happens in conversations where someone mentions a detail that sits strangely in the mind of the listener. It happens when a journalist revisits an old case for unrelated reasons and stumbles on a reference that doesn't fit. It happens when a detective with a sharp instinct senses a thread connecting seemingly unrelated pieces. This is how attention forms, not through dramatic revelations, but through small alignments, coincidences that start to feel less like coincidence, until eventually someone looks twice instead of once. Rex's internal world, however, didn't register these shifts as threats. To him, life proceeded more or less as it always had, each day filled with tasks, responsibilities, and the familiar pressure of balancing roles. What he didn't see, what no one sees until it's too late, was that the environment that had once shielded him had turned subtly reflective. Every footprint left an imprint. Every routine left a pattern. Every decision, every movement, every interaction cast a faint shadow that modern society stored automatically. Shadow upon shadow, faint but cumulative, building a picture that even he couldn't erase because he didn't know it was being painted. And by the time the attention around him began consolidating, by the time investigators realized the countless small impressions pointing in the same direction, the quiet cocoon he had relied on was no longer protecting him. It was tightening. He simply hadn't yet felt the pressure of the walls closing in. Chapter 9. The ground begins to shift as the months move quietly forward. The investigation surrounding the long-cold Gilgo Beach mystery was entering a new era, one shaped less by intuition and more by the precise, methodical weight of emerging technology. Detectives who had once sifted through physical clues now found themselves navigating enormous corridors of digital information. Phone records that had seemed unremarkable years earlier were revisited with refined tools capable of detecting patterns too subtle for the human eye. DNA technologies that hadn't existed during the early stages of the case were now considered routine. The landscape of police work had changed, and without ever knowing it, Rex Heuermann's world was about to change with it. What had once protected him, time, confusion, outdated forensic limits, was no longer offering the shelter it once did. The case that had frustrated investigators for more than a decade was awakening, gaining sharpness, clarity, and focus. And in the stillness of Massapequa Park, Rex moved through his days unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting grain by grain, evidence by evidence. In homicide divisions, the tone was different. Detectives who had been there since the early years carried a quiet determination that had hardened into resolve. They had seen too many false leads collapse, too many promising angles die out, and too many grieving families wait in silence. Now, with new hands joining seasoned investigators, there was a renewed electricity, a sense that the case was no longer frozen in the past. Meetings grew longer. Conversations deepened. Theories once dismissed as far-fetched were re-examined with fresh eyes. And it was in these long, quiet sessions that threads buried for years began to surface. A disposable phone that had pinged too close to a victim's location, a vehicle description that matched a small, specific demographic, a series of calls made at odd hours, looping through towers in ways that didn't quite match the patterns of typical suburban routines, like tea first. These observations were small, pieces of a puzzle that didn't announce themselves loudly. But experienced detectives know that major breakthroughs rarely come from dramatic discoveries. They come from accumulation. And as more data points were reviewed, replotted, and cross-referenced, certain markers began to stand out. A cluster of phone pings near Gilgo Beach. A distinct vehicle model seen repeatedly in witness statements. A particular path of travel between Manhattan and Long Island. None of these pointed to a single person yet, but collectively, they narrowed the field in a way that had never happened before. In a case where anonymity had once been a powerful shield, the edges of that shield were wearing down. Meanwhile, the community itself remained removed from the details unfolding inside police conference rooms. People went on with their daily routines. Morning commutes, school drop-offs, weekend errands. The quiet neighborhoods lining the South Shore seemed unchanged on the surface. Calm streets, well-kept homes, the hum of normal life. And in the middle of it all, Rex continued living the same structured routine he always had. He drove to work, attended meetings, answered emails, ran errands, handled renovations. To anyone watching, he appeared as steady as ever. No one sensed turbulence. No one sensed a shift. But beneath that calm veneer, the investigation's renewed momentum was beginning to align directly beneath his feet. In Manhattan, where he worked daily, the environment around him carried a very different rhythm. Fast, loud, indifferent. Thousands of people passed him without a glance, their lives too busy to notice anyone in particular. But investigators had begun constructing a timeline that placed certain movements in sharp contrast with this anonymity. Men and women who had once been questioned briefly years earlier were contacted again. Phone companies received new subpoenas. Digital records, long forgotten by everyone, except the servers that stored them, were suddenly under forensic examination. What had once been dismissed as background noise was now being treated as signal. And for the first time, this signal was beginning to point in his direction. The detectives working the case were careful, almost methodical in their caution. They had seen too many promising leads fall apart before. They knew public confidence hinged on the quality of their work. So they refused to rush. They rechecked timelines. They verified every connection twice. They analyzed tower logs hour by hour, then minute by minute. They compared patterns from unrelated data sources, looking not for a single smoking gun, but for a constellation of small consistencies. The kind that no suspect, especially one who had lived an ordinary life for decades, could fully erase. And slowly, that constellation began to form. What made the process so unusual was the dual nature of the world Rex inhabited. In his personal life, everything was steady and predictable. In the investigative world, his profile was becoming sharper with every passing week. This contrast, the quietness of his daily existence versus the intensifying scrutiny behind the scenes, created a tension neither he nor the people around him felt yet, but it was tightening with each passing day. The detectives didn't have a name yet. Not officially, not in writing, but they were circling closer to someone whose routines, movements, and digital shadow seemed to overlap with the case more often than coincidence should allow. And while no one voiced it out loud, everyone sensed the same slow, steady realization forming in the room. They were getting close. As investigators pushed deeper into the layers of the case, what had once been a scattered mosaic of data points was beginning to take shape, forming a clearer image with each cross-reference, each re-examined clue, each unexpected overlap. But clarity in an investigation like this does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like a distant fog that slowly outlines the edges of a coastline you didn't know you were approaching. That is how the detectives began to notice that the person behind the emerging patterns wasn't an abstract figure anymore. He had routines, commutes, habits, a household, a history. The anonymous dots on a digital map began to resemble the outline of a living, breathing individual. Tower pings connected to work schedules. Vehicle descriptions intersected with known commute corridors. Certain locations matched the rhythm of a man who split his life between Manhattan's intensity and Long Island's quiet. They didn't know his name yet, not officially, but the abstract silhouette forming in their files was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like inevitability. And as that inevitability grew, a subtle shift happened within the investigative team. Voices lowered, meetings tightened, and the sense of proximity increased, creating a kind of focused silence that always precedes breakthroughs. Outside of the precinct walls, life continued normally. Families cooked dinner. Teenagers hung out on street corners. Commuters scrolled through their phones on evening trains. In Massapequa Park, the neighborhood lived in its familiar rhythm. Trash pickup days, porch lights flickering on at dusk, neighbors exchanging small talk over fences. Rex Heuermann continued moving through this world the same way he always had, carrying grocery bags, walking from the driveway to his front door, sitting at his desk, answering questions in meetings. Nothing in his demeanor suggested that anything in his life had changed. Nothing hinted that a quiet storm of scrutiny was gathering just out of view. He lived inside a bubble of routine he had trusted for decades, steady, ordinary, dependable, unaware that investigators were now building a timeline so detailed it could capture even the smallest deviations he made without noticing. The next major shift came not from a dramatic new piece of evidence, but from the way older clues were reinterpreted under new light. A discarded phone number, once dismissed, was run through modern analytics that revealed unusual calling patterns. Vehicle registrations were analyzed with updated tools, filtering thousands of possibilities into a much smaller pool. The timeline of certain victims aligned more closely with movements of a particular individual who had not been in the first set of suspect lists. When detectives revisited witness statements, small phrases took on new meaning. Comments about a large man, a specific type of car, an unusual voice on the other end of a phone call. What had once been fragments of unrelated memories started to interlock like pieces of a puzzle someone had finally turned in the right direction. Inside the task force office, the energy shifted. Investigators who had once guarded their optimism now felt something they rarely allowed themselves to feel in long-term cases: traction. Every detective in the room understood the significance of that feeling. Traction means the case is no longer drifting in uncertainty. It is steering toward a conclusion. That didn't mean they were close to an arrest. It meant they were close to a name. And in a case like this, a name is a tectonic shift, a reveal that transforms years of searching into a focused pursuit. The team began rerunning timelines, testing theories, recreating possible sequences of events. They combed through databases not for dramatic proof, but for consistency, the quiet, logical alignment of facts that, once synchronized, becomes impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Rex continued living inside an entirely different timeline. His days remained structured, almost predictable. The morning routines, the drive to Manhattan, the emails, the architectural drafts, the conversations with colleagues, the return home late at night. He noticed nothing out of the ordinary, no unusual cars on his street, no unexpected interactions, no changes in how people looked at him. The world, as far as he could see, was functioning exactly the same. But in the investigative world, his anonymity was evaporating. The digital shadows he had left behind over the years, the ones so small they seemed meaningless, were now being collected and examined with precision. And as investigators aligned these shadows, the silhouette they formed became unmistakable. It was around this time that the task force began drafting the list, a quiet document that never leaves the room, containing the handful of individuals whose data most consistently overlaps with the case. They didn't tell anyone outside the investigation. They didn't act on it yet. They simply watched. They observed patterns across days, weeks, months. They reviewed financial movements, travel records, employment logs, property documents, phone history. This wasn't surveillance yet, just a tightening of focus. a narrowing of possibility. A quiet awareness that one person on the list seemed to match the shape of the shadow closer than anyone else. In the community, small changes began happening that no one connected to the growing investigation. Extra patrols appeared on certain roads. Detectives in unmarked cars drove slowly through neighborhoods at odd hours, taking notes. Certain addresses were reviewed discreetly. Street cameras were checked for functionality. These were precautionary steps, the early preparations for what might eventually become a major operation if the evidence continued aligning. Residents noticed nothing unusual, chalking up unfamiliar vehicles to contractors, visiting relatives, or general city activity. No one suspected they were witnessing the earliest signs of an investigative tightening around someone they passed on sidewalks without giving a second thought. Back inside the task force, what had once been speculation began feeling like direction. The detectives weren't ready to say the name aloud yet. Not until they were certain. Not until every possible error had been erased. But the case was no longer floating in uncertainty. It had traction, clarity, and momentum. And the man at the center of the forming picture remained unaware that the slow, steady light of scrutiny was beginning to illuminate the spaces around him. His world hadn't changed, but the world watching him had. Chapter 10. The quiet turned toward one man. As the intelligence gathered by the task force grew more refined, the atmosphere inside the investigation shifted from broad searching to focused examination, like a camera lens slowly tightening until a once blurred landscape revealed a single figure standing in the center. The detectives still didn't speak the name openly, not out loud, not in front of the full team, but the momentum pointed unmistakably toward one man whose digital shadow, residential proximity, travel patterns, and years of routine fit too neatly against the timeline of the case. It was a sensation every experienced investigator recognized, the moment when randomness gives way to pattern, when the fog begins lifting from a coastline that had always been there, just obscured. And as this clarity grew, so did the gravity of their responsibility. They knew that naming a suspect prematurely could derail everything. They also knew that ignoring the convergence of evidence would be a disservice to victims who had waited more than a decade for answers. So they proceeded with measured discipline, each step cautious but deliberate, each decision checked twice, then checked again. During these weeks, Rex continued living within the rhythm of his quiet, structured life. Massapequa Park remained the same blend of calm streets, trimmed lawns, and familiar homes. Nothing in the air hinted that investigators were edging closer. Nothing in daily interaction suggested a shift in how others saw him. He drove to work the same way he had for years, parked in the same Manhattan garage, walked the same few blocks to his office, checked emails, attended meetings, reviewed architectural plans. These routines had become so embedded in his life that he moved through them almost unconsciously, unaware that investigators were mapping these same pathways from afar, comparing them to time-stamped digital traces, seeing alignment where he saw nothing but habit. It was the contrast between these two realities, his unchanged daily rhythm and the investigation's tightening focus, that created a quiet tension neither he nor his neighbors felt yet, but which grew stronger with each passing day inside the task force office. The detectives now entered the most delicate stage of any long-term case, the pattern confirmation phase. In this stage, the goal wasn't to find a smoking gun. It was to make sure the emerging picture wasn't the result of coincidence. They began testing the alignment between locations and timelines from different angles. Weather conditions of the time, traffic logs, toll booth data, old transit schedules, even construction permits that might alter travel paths. They re-examined how long it would take to move between specific points on nights when key events occurred. They mapped cell tower sectors using updated software, revealing coverage areas far more accurate than what was available a decade earlier. These refinements didn't radically change the case. Instead, they sharpened it, reducing uncertainty inch by inch until the investigative picture became uncomfortably clear. As they worked, they also revisited victim profiles, not to determine guilt, but to build behavioral context. They analyzed similarities between locations, communications, and vulnerabilities. They studied the intervals between disappearances and the timing of each discovery. They examined how certain patterns echoed one another, not perfectly, but closely enough to suggest intentionality rather than chance. These insights didn't point directly to one person, but they strengthened the framework needed to evaluate the emerging suspect against behavioral markers that aligned with the case. Detectives were careful, though. They knew too well that confirmation bias could destroy a good investigation. So they tested every assumption, challenged every hypothesis, and scrutinized each conclusion from multiple angles. The closer they got to naming a person of interest, the more rigorous they became. In the community, everything remained unchanged on the surface. People walked dogs at dusk. Children rode bikes under streetlights. Neighbors exchanged small talk about weekend plans. The quietness of the neighborhood made the idea of a major suspect living among them unthinkable. That disbelief, that comfort of normalcy, had shielded the suspect for years. But it also meant that when investigators eventually made their presence known, the shock would be amplified. For now, however, the task force worked in near total silence, determined not to alert anyone prematurely, mindful that even a hint of scrutiny could cause a suspect to change habits or retreat deeper into secrecy. Meanwhile, the detectives began assembling what they informally referred to as the circle, the core collection of evidence points and timeline matches that directly connected the emerging suspect to the broader investigative pattern. This wasn't enough for an arrest, not yet, but it was enough to confirm that the next steps would be aimed at a single individual rather than a wide field of possibilities. The circle included digital traces, geographic consistency, moments of unexplained overlap between suspect activity and victim disappearance, and behavioral markers that fit the psychological profile detectives had built over years. None of it proved guilt. All of it demanded deeper investigation. In the precinct, the tone became quieter but more focused. Detectives lowered their voices even in private rooms. Conversations happened with doors closed. The team moved with a sense of direction that hadn't been present in earlier years. They knew what came next: surveillance, deeper background checks, DNA reevaluation, and the slow, methodical process of building a case that left no room for doubt. They understood the stakes, not just for the suspect, but for the families who had waited so long for clarity. And so, inch by inch, they prepared themselves for the moment when the investigation would shift from analysis to action. By the time the task force drafted their preliminary summary, a significant internal threshold had been crossed. They were no longer asking whether the case had a viable suspect. They were asking what they needed to confirm that the person they were circling was indeed the critical figure in the investigation. And though Rex Heuermann remained unaware of the tightening focus, the investigative world was now looking directly at him, preparing for the steps that would define the final trajectory of the case. As the task force continued refining its evidence, the internal atmosphere moved from cautious curiosity to deliberate, measured momentum, the kind that rises not from sudden breakthroughs, but from the steady accumulation of countless small confirmations. Investigators found themselves returning repeatedly to the same name, not officially, not stamped at the top of any report, but spoken quietly in side conversations, circled on whiteboards, and highlighted in digital files that only a few eyes were permitted to view. Each time they revisited the case's timelines, that same individual appeared in proximity to key locations. Each time they evaluated phone data, the same patterns emerged. And each time they compared behaviors, geography, and opportunity windows, the alignment grew stronger. It wasn't proof. It wasn't certainty, but it was direction. And in a long-running investigation like Gilgo Beach, direction had become the rarest and most valuable commodity. The team could feel the subtle shift in the room. They were no longer wandering the maze. They were following a path. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the suspect's life continued with the same rhythms, unbroken and familiar. He walked down his street at night, returned from the train station carrying his work bag, pulled into his driveway after long days in the city. The neighbors who saw him had no reason to think twice. He looked tired, absorbed in his daily responsibilities, focused on routine tasks like any other commuter balancing work and home. The house stood as it always had, quiet and unremarkable, with no outward sign of tension or disruption. What he could not see, what no one in the neighborhood could sense, was that detectives were now analyzing his life with a precision that went far beyond casual observation. They weren't following him yet, but they were mapping the contours of his days, the places he frequented, the times he traveled, the errands he ran, the appointments he kept. They weren't interested in his personal life, only in whether the shape of his routines matched the shape of the investigation. And the more they looked, the more those shapes aligned. Inside the task force rooms, this stage of the case demanded a different level of discipline. Investigators knew the worst mistake they could make was assuming the emerging pattern was absolute. So they challenged themselves. They assigned separate detectives to evaluate the same data from opposing angles. They recreated potential timelines with and without the suspect's presence. They considered alternate explanations for every overlap, testing whether coincidence, statistical noise, or benign behavior could account for what they were seeing. This internal skepticism wasn't intended to undermine progress. It was meant to protect it. In high-stakes cases, the most important revelations are the ones that survive scrutiny from every possible direction. And as each challenge was raised, tested, and resolved, the pattern continued holding firm. What made this stage particularly complex was the delicate boundary between suspicion and confirmation. Investigators were not accusing anyone. They were evaluating possibility. And yet, the closer they looked, the more the evidence seemed to build upon itself. Across states, across databases, across more than a decade of information, the same digital shadow kept appearing in the same places where critical events unfolded. A phone ping here, a travel log there, a billing record that didn't attract attention at the time, but now, years later, fit neatly into the growing picture. The investigators didn't yet know where this path would lead them. They only knew that the case no longer resembled the sprawling mystery it once was. It was narrowing, focusing, sharpening. The work now extended beyond data. Detectives began studying the suspect's history, not to pass judgment, but to understand context. They looked into employment records, reviewing long workdays that stretched into evenings, trying to understand where free hours existed and where they did not. They examined the timeline of address changes. They mapped out commutes to determine how often routes overlapped with areas relevant to the case. They reviewed archive material from unrelated incidents or interviews that might offer hints about travel habits, personal preferences, or routine behaviors. The suspect's life story, once just a collection of ordinary adult responsibilities, was now being evaluated for its structural fit within the timeline of the broader investigation. Back at the precinct, conversations among detectives grew more intentional. This wasn't informal speculation anymore. This was preparation. They discussed the logistics of surveillance, should the investigation eventually warrant it. They talked about evidence-gathering procedures, subpoena timelines, and the kinds of warrants that might become necessary if the pattern solidified. They worked with forensic analysts to determine which older evidence samples might now be testable because of technological advancements. They met with prosecutors, not to name a suspect, but to ensure that every present and future step adhered strictly to legal requirements, safeguarding the integrity of the case. The focus was no longer theoretical. It was procedural, practical, forward-moving. As this process unfolded, the broader world remained unaware of the shift. The media wasn't watching the investigation at this point. The community was living its life. The suspect was going to work, returning home, managing tasks, unaware that decades-old clues were converging in ways he could never have anticipated. Nothing about his daily existence signaled that anything was wrong, but the walls around the investigation were quietly tightening. The detectives weren't ready to move yet, not even close. But they were preparing for the moment when the evidence would reach a threshold that could not be ignored. And in that preparation, a subtle sense of inevitability began to grow. This phase didn't involve confrontation or surveillance or arrests. It involved quiet diligence, the quietness that always precedes the moments when an investigation begins transitioning from analysis to action. Outside, the world continued. Inside the task force, the clock had begun ticking differently, and whether the suspect knew it or not, his anonymity was fading. Not publicly, not visibly, but within the walls of the investigation, the picture had begun to form, and it was pointing in his direction. Chapter 11. The first unseen watchers. As the investigation entered its next phase, the task force moved from quiet analysis to slow, cautious observation. Not surveillance in the cinematic sense, not officers following a suspect through crowded streets, but the earliest, most delicate form of monitoring, gathering information in real time without ever stepping into the suspect's line of sight. Investigators didn't tail him yet. They simply studied the places he interacted with. They checked which security cameras operated along his daily routes. They noted the entrances and exits of his office building in Manhattan. They identified the busiest hours on his block in Massapequa Park and the quietest corners where a patrol car could sit unnoticed. None of this involved approaching him or altering his routine. Instead, they were mapping the environment around him, the structural, geographical, and logistical details that one day might matter if the investigation escalated. It was the stage where detectives learned the rhythm of a suspect's world before ever stepping into it, observing the architecture of his life so they could move through it without disturbance. At this point, the suspect remained entirely unaware. Rex Heuermann continued his life with the same steady patterns he had relied on for years. Morning commutes by car, long hours in an office filled with architectural renderings. Occasional late night returns home to a quiet suburban street. His routines were so consistent that investigators could almost predict them once they mapped them out, but they resisted the urge to draw conclusions too quickly. In long-term investigations, predictability must be treated as data, not as evidence. So they watched the environment instead of the man, allowing his habits to reveal themselves naturally, without pressure, without change, without interference. The detectives knew that approaching too soon or watching too closely risked triggering deviations that could compromise everything. So the investigation remained invisible, like a faint breeze no one notices even though it shifts the air. Inside the task force, the detectives reviewed updated information daily. They studied newly synchronized databases that aligned long-stored digital traces with contemporary mapping tools. They compared old travel records to new patterns, charting times and dates that once seemed disconnected. This process wasn't glamorous. It involved hours of cross-referencing, small discoveries that required verification, and endless moments where the task force had to maintain patience rather than chase the illusion of quick answers. Yet through this slow, deliberate process, the team began building a more complete picture of how one person moved through the physical world at the time key events unfolded. Where he traveled, how long he stayed in certain areas, whether his movements aligned with ordinary life or mirrored coincidences repeated too often to ignore. The detectives also began constructing what they called a behavioral backdrop, not a psychological profile, but a contextual understanding of the suspect's habits, personality, social interactions, and daily demeanor. They reviewed statements from people who had known him years earlier, colleagues who described him as intense but professional, neighbors who saw him as quiet and distant, and acquaintances who remembered little beyond his imposing height and serious expression. These impressions didn't point to criminal behavior. They created a baseline, a portrait of an ordinary man living an ordinary life. And that was the part investigators studied most carefully, because long-term investigations often hinge on the contrast between outward normalcy and subtle inconsistencies hidden within everyday routines. At this stage, detectives also revisited forensic material that had sat in evidence lockers for years. Technological advancements had turned old limitations into new opportunities. DNA mixtures that couldn't be separated a decade earlier were now testable. Older fibers could be examined with updated microscopes. Digital forensics allowed phone records to be reconstructed far more accurately, than when the case first started. These weren't breakthroughs yet, just possibilities. The team knew that even if new tests produced information, the results had to fit into the broader timeline, not create contradictions. Precision mattered more than speed. Every detail had to be airtight if their investigation eventually pointed toward a single suspect. In the midst of these developments, detectives began noticing subtle alignments between time frames, alignments that didn't prove anything on their own but strengthened the case for continued observation. Certain dates matched business trips. Certain overnight delays in Manhattan aligned with key case milestones. Certain free hours or altered routines corresponded with movements investigators had already mapped. They proceeded cautiously, aware that coincidences can mislead even seasoned professionals. The goal at this stage was not to interpret the data, but to refine it, trimming inconsistencies, verifying approximations, testing assumptions. Only once the information became solid would they allow themselves to draw conclusions. Meanwhile, the world outside the investigation remained oblivious. The community was peaceful. News cycles focused on unrelated topics. Neighbors passed each other on sidewalks without a second thought. Even Rex himself remained fully absorbed in his everyday responsibilities, deadlines, meetings, errands, personal obligations. Nothing in his behavior suggested he felt watched, and that was precisely the point. The investigators were not watching him. They were watching everything around him. They were positioning themselves for a future stage, preparing for the moment when observation would become scrutiny and scrutiny would become action. But they weren't there yet. Not even close. Every step had to be taken with extreme care. The detectives knew from experience that premature moves could collapse an investigation entirely. If the suspect altered his routine, changed his devices, adjusted his habits, intentionally or not, it could introduce gaps that would take months to repair. So they did nothing that would create even a shadow of suspicion. No unmarked cars positioned outside his house. No sudden paperwork inquiries. No changes in how phone companies responded to subpoenas. Everything unfolded under a cloak of normalcy, beneath layers of routine, behind the noise of everyday life. And in that quietness, the investigation matured. It grew more disciplined, more focused, more certain of its direction. Investigators weren't ready to apply pressure yet, but they were close to the threshold where the case would shift from distant analysis to direct observation. And once they crossed that threshold, the world around the suspect, still calm, still silent, still unremarkable, would begin to reshape itself in ways he could never have anticipated. As investigators continued shaping the invisible perimeter around the suspect's world, the task force shifted from passive observation to quiet preparation, developing contingency plans for scenarios that could unfold weeks or even months down the line. This wasn't surveillance yet, not the kind that followed a suspect's every move, but a careful strengthening of the investigative framework. Detectives reviewed jurisdictional boundaries, making sure cooperation between agencies remained smooth. They evaluated which legal pathways would be the cleanest if certain evidence evolved into actionable leads. They prepared drafts of warrant templates, not to use immediately, but to ensure that when the moment arrived, they wouldn't waste a single hour. In long-term cases, readiness is a weapon, and the task force sharpened it in silence. Inside the briefing room, investigators began assembling what they informally called the structural timeline, a layered diagram that examined daily routines, professional obligations, personal habits, geographical movements, and any recurring windows of unstructured time. This wasn't about predicting guilt. It was about preparing to test possibilities. If a piece of evidence later required precise timing comparisons, they wanted a timeline already built with verified data rather than assumptions. The structural timeline became one of the most important tools in the investigation, a subtle map of how life unfolded around the suspect, hour by hour, week by week. With each update, the timeline grew more stable, more exact, and more informative than anything they had months earlier. As investigators refined this internal framework, they also began exploring communication patterns across the years, not intercepted messages, but previously documented records, public databases, old call logs preserved through routine backups, and legal administrative files from past business dealings. Every scrap of publicly available or legally obtained communication helped create a broader picture of how Rex interacted with clients, colleagues, and acquaintances. They weren't looking for incriminating content. They were looking for consistency. Did his tone change in certain scenarios? Did his availability fluctuate in ways that overlapped with key periods? Did financial activity shift in step with unexplained gaps in his schedule? These patterns didn't accuse. They revealed behavior, and behavior would become a cornerstone when the case eventually advanced. Meanwhile, the detectives embedded in the task force leaned heavily into victimology, revisiting the earliest files with fresh eyes. They reconstructed the routines of the victims, examined their last known movements, and traced the invisible threads connecting each disappearance to broader environmental factors: freeway access, cell coverage zones at the time, traffic conditions on specific nights, and patterns of foot traffic that might have influenced opportunity. By revisiting the victims' worlds, investigators weren't trying to retroactively assign blame. They were searching for a common rhythm, a shared vulnerability, or a repeating coincidence that might further validate the direction of the case. The more they learned about the victims, the more precisely they could test hypotheses about the suspect. Outside the investigation room, the suspect lived life unchanged. His days carried the same predictable cadence: early morning departures, long work hours behind architectural drawings and client meetings, occasional stops for errands, and quiet returns to the suburban home where neighbors rarely noticed anything unusual. The investigators found this remarkable, not because it suggested anything specifically, but because consistency is an anchor in long-term inquiries. It allows detectives to differentiate between natural behavior and sudden shifts. And at this stage, consistency was everywhere in his routine. He was stable. He was steady. He was unremarkable. And that steady normalcy was precisely what allowed investigators to proceed without risk. There were moments, however, when silence drifted into tension. Detectives knew that the deeper they ventured into the investigation, the thinner the line between caution and escalation became. They began discussing when, not if, they would eventually initiate direct surveillance. They analyzed which locations offered the safest vantage points, which hours provided natural cover, and which patterns of movement could be observed without influencing the suspect's behavior. These discussions weren't decisions yet. They were rehearsals, preparing for a transition no one could afford to get wrong. In cases where suspect routine is stable, the first moment of active monitoring must be flawless. One miscalculation, one sudden deviation, and the entire operation could collapse. Investigators also deepened their analysis of digital era advancements, preparing for tests that hadn't existed when the earliest crimes occurred. They coordinated with forensic specialists who could re-examine physical material using newer chemical processes. They consulted with data analysts who could reconstruct old communication records with improved clarity. They prepared for the possibility that previously inconclusive items might now yield clarity. The team treated each step with restraint. In cold case investigations, overconfidence is dangerous. Investigators understand that even the strongest seeming lead may dissolve under scrutiny. So they approached new possibilities with caution, verifying each step before moving to the next. Slowly, a picture emerged, not of guilt but of alignment. Tiny overlaps between timelines, subtle consistencies between behavior and opportunity. Correlations that were once invisible began to shimmer faintly along the edges of the case. Investigators didn't celebrate these developments. They didn't even fully trust them yet. But they recognized the significance. The case was no longer stagnant. It was breathing again, alive again, and that meant the time for quiet observation was nearing its end. Yet the world outside remained peaceful. Neighbors cut their lawns. Delivery trucks passed down tree-lined streets. Families walked dogs on summer evenings, unaware that detectives were quietly mapping the geography of a life just a few blocks away. Even Rex himself, going about his routine without suspicion, had no reason to think his world was being slowly encircled by a team of investigators who now understood the shape of his movement, the rhythm of his habits, and the structure of his days. And so the task force continued its work in silence, steady and calculated, preparing for the inevitable shift from environmental observation to targeted scrutiny, a shift that would transform speculation into certainty and quiet monitoring into a precise, deliberate next step. They weren't there yet, but the path was forming beneath their feet. And soon, the investigation would take another irreversible step forward. Chapter 12. The circle quietly contracts by the time the task force moved into the next phase of the investigation. The rhythm inside the command center had changed. There was more urgency in the way agents walked between desks, more quiet collaboration in corners of the room, more late-night conversations analyzing details that had been revisited dozens of times. The team wasn't jumping to action, not yet, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way everyone could feel. It was the difference between watching from a distance and preparing to step forward. Detectives began building what they called the contraction map, a layered diagram that identified which aspects of the suspect's life were stable, which were variable, and which were unexamined. Every stable point gave investigators an anchor, a predictable element that could support later timelines. Every variable point created a question mark, a place where further scrutiny would eventually be required. They weren't trying to prove guilt. They were narrowing the margins around uncertainty itself. While analysts refined the map, another team focused on the surrounding environment, not the suspect, but the world he moved through. Neighborhood patterns, business schedules, seasonal traffic flows, delivery routes, even the natural rhythms of the community during different hours of the day. By understanding the environment, investigators could interpret movement more accurately later on. Context mattered, and the team needed as much context as possible before taking the next step. Inside the digital forensics room, specialists compared historical location data, archived communication records, and public databases, not for dramatic revelations, but for subtle trends. The patterns they found didn't point to conclusions, but they tightened the investigative lens. For example, they noted that certain dates aligned with routine personal commitments, making those windows less ambiguous. Other dates were more flexible, and therefore more relevant for future comparison. It was slow work, meticulous work, but the kind of work that builds strong cases long before they ever enter a courtroom. Meanwhile, veteran investigators revisited early interviews with neighbors, coworkers, and acquaintances. They didn't question anyone again. They simply reanalyzed what had already been documented. People often reveal more than they realize through tone, phrasing, or what they choose not to emphasize. Revisiting these details sometimes sharpened aspects of the suspect's baseline personality, whether he was private or social, predictable or spontaneous, routine-driven or flexible. Personality profiles aren't evidence, but they help investigators interpret behavior through a clearer lens. And through it all, the suspect's life continued without disruption. He kept his usual work schedule, maintained normal errands, and moved through each day with the same quiet routine that had characterized his life for years. There are no sudden changes, no abrupt deviations, nothing that raised immediate concern. For investigators, that stability was both reassuring and telling. It meant that their presence was undetected and that they still had the advantage of time. Behind closed doors, however, the task force reached an agreement. They were approaching the threshold where passive information gathering would no longer be enough. Soon, they would need to move from preparation to observation. Not surveillance in the cinematic sense, nothing intrusive, but a more focused understanding of where the suspect was, how he moved, and how those movements aligned with the slowly tightening timeline. They were not rushing. They were simply getting ready for the next phase. And with that readiness came a quiet shift in the room, the sense that the long, patient groundwork was nearly complete and that the investigation would soon step into a new chapter, one where every detail mattered even more than before. As the investigators transitioned deeper into their strategy, the focus shifted from simply understanding the suspect's environment to anticipating how he might move within it under pressure. They weren't applying pressure yet. but they were preparing for the moment when observation would give way to active engagement. Senior analysts began creating what they called behavioral vectors, projected paths that showed how the suspect typically structured his day, what routes he favored, where he paused, and which patterns remained consistent regardless of external circumstances. Every pattern, no matter how mundane, was a potential landmark for future investigative steps. While one team analyzed patterns, another continued to refine the timeline, not adding new events, but reorganizing them so that every detail rested in the most logical position. It was like tightening the stitches of a long, careful seam. Meanwhile, detectives revisited the suspect's public behavior, reviewing old statements, casual comments, and community interactions. They weren't looking for admissions, they were looking for rhythms. The way a person carries themselves can reveal as much as anything they say. And in these records, the task force found the portrait of a man who valued routine, privacy, and predictability. A man who lived inside carefully controlled order. As the profile became clearer, investigators began to sketch out possible future scenarios, not because they expected sudden changes, but because contingency planning kept them prepared. What would happen if the suspect altered his routine unexpectedly? What would happen if someone contacted him unexpectedly? What would happen if media coverage intensified? All of these were questions the task force rehearsed quietly, behind closed doors, not because action was imminent, but because readiness prevented mistakes later. At the same time, community intelligence officers revisited earlier canvassing notes, examining whether any overlooked details might become useful in this tightening phase. Sometimes, an offhand comment by a neighbor or a casual remark overheard in a workplace can become significant when viewed through the lens of updated context. These subtle insights helped investigators refine their sense of the suspect's internal world, how he perceived himself, how he navigated social spaces, and how he maintained boundaries between personal life and public presence. The more they understood this personal architecture, the more accurately they could predict transitions in behavior. And this, more than anything else, was what the team needed as they prepared for the next step. Because the investigation had entered a delicate stage, the final stretch of quiet positioning before the momentum shifted. In law enforcement, they're at a moment where an investigation stops expanding outward and begins pulling everything inward, narrowing toward a single point. This was that moment. The circle around the suspect was no longer widening. It was tightening. No confrontation was planned, no move scheduled, but the task force could feel the shift. The small movements had aligned, the patterns made more sense, and the once scattered pieces now formed a picture no one could ignore. And so they continued forward with the same quiet, steady determination, knowing that the closer they came to the center of the circle, the more critical every step would become. Chapter 13. Echoes beneath the surface. The weeks after Heuermann's arrest felt strangely suspended, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. The frenzy outside, the reporters, the satellite trucks, the flashing lights, was replaced by a quieter, heavier kind of tension inside the investigative offices. Detectives who had spent years chasing shadows were now staring at boxes of evidence that suddenly had weight, meaning, and context. Inside a room marked simply evidence, one long table held items collected from Rex's home and office. Mannequins leaned stiffly in one corner. Folders stuffed with documents lay open like long-closed secrets finally breathing air. Each object created its own small echo of possibility, an echo that made detectives wonder just how deep this story truly went. While Rex sat behind bars, the investigation around him expanded like a ripple across water. The team combing through his computer archives spoke in low, serious voices. Reviewing digital histories was like walking through the blueprint of a hidden life. Sessions, searches, patterns that suggested a mind both compartmentalized and restless. Nothing was conclusive on its own, yet every piece held a kind of gravitational pull, begging to be connected. Meanwhile, other investigators dug into Rex's past. Who had he been as a young man? What habits, relationships, and changes marked the years before anyone knew his name? Former co-workers from architectural firms described him as quiet, methodical, and occasionally intense. Clients talked about his attention to detail, sometimes so sharp it bordered on controlling. Neighbors recalled a man who walked with purpose, eyes straight ahead, rarely lingering long enough for small talk. It was the life of a man who blended routine with secrecy. Behind closed doors, investigators reconstructed the timeline of Rex's daily movements. Miles driven, calls placed, weekends spent alone in his truck. Some patterns aligned neatly with the case files. Others created new questions that hovered just out of reach. It felt like walking a dimly lit hallway where every door might reveal something unsettling. At the same time, outside the police walls, Long Island was trying to regain its balance. Families along the quiet roads near Gilgo Beach went back to morning routines, but something had changed. Parents kept porch lights on longer. People walked their dogs less at night. Conversations at grocery stores lowered as someone passed by. Long Island had always lived with a certain rhythm, but now that rhythm felt slightly off, out of tune by one haunting note. For investigators, the emotional toll was undeniable. Some had lived with this case longer than they'd lived with certain friendships. They remember the early days when the remains were first found, how the wind off the ocean carried a stillness everyone felt but couldn't explain. They remembered nights staring at maps covered in colored pins, wondering if they'd ever see the truth. Now the truth was finally visible, but in a way that felt heavier than anyone had expected. Not because it was over, but because it was only just beginning. With Rex in custody, the question was no longer who. Now it was how much more. Detectives revisited old reports, missing persons, tips from people who were never fully believed, strange sightings that once seemed insignificant. They lifted each one to the light again, turning it between their fingers, searching for anything that might connect to the man now sitting in a cell. Every page felt different now. Every line held new weight. And while the investigation intensified, Rex himself remained calm, almost too calm. To his attorneys, he spoke in measured tones, analytical, as if discussing the layout of a building rather than the case against him. To guards, he was polite, detached, a man observing his own life from a distance. Journalists speculated endlessly about this demeanor. Was it denial? Confidence? Or simply a man so used to living behind layers that even now, those layers held strong? In the community, opinions clashed. Some insisted he had lived a double life. Others swore he couldn't possibly be what the charges claimed. They pointed to his career, his family, the everyday normalcy that wrapped around his life like camouflage. But normalcy means little in the face of evidence, and each day, investigators found themselves holding new pieces of a story that refused to remain simple. A break came quietly one afternoon when a detective reviewing satellite imagery, timestamps, and cell data noticed a subtle overlap, something that had been overlooked before. It wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to open a different angle of inquiry. And in cases like this, one new angle could unravel an entire chapter. Back at the precinct, a whiteboard filled with charts and names grew more crowded by the hour. Investigators leaned in close, exchanging theories under their breath. The mood wasn't triumphant. It was focused, determined. They weren't looking for victory. They were looking for clarity, justice, and answers that had eluded them for more than a decade. Outside, fall leaves drifted across sidewalks near Gilgo Beach. Waves rolled in with their usual, steady rhythm. The world looked the same as it always had, but the truth beneath its surface was changing. And in the center of it all, the name Heuermann hovered like a shadow, one that stretched farther than anyone first imagined. As autumn deepened across Long Island, the investigative command center shifted into a new rhythm. Detectives who once worked separate strands of the Gilgo Beach case now sat shoulder to shoulder, comparing notes, digital logs, old interviews, and quietly stored memories. The room hummed with a kind of focused unease, like the stillness before a storm no one could see, but everyone knew was there. Stacks of reports sat on nearly every desk. Some pages were yellowed from age, others crisp from recent printouts, but they all carried one thread of tension. Each held a possibility that had been missed, misunderstood, or simply overlooked before Rex Heuermann's arrest changed the entire landscape. The case was no longer a distant mystery. It was a living structure investigators were now able to walk through with a flashlight instead of blindfolded hands. One of the biggest challenges was the sheer scale of re-examination. Detectives sifted through thousands of digital files, cell tower logs, transactional histories, network pings that lit up parts of the tri-state area like constellations. On screens, lines crisscrossed like electrical currents, some faint, some bold, some leading nowhere, and some circling back toward Heuermann's routines with an uncomfortable precision. The deeper analysts went, the more they felt they were tracing the outline of someone who had carefully divided their life into compartments few ever saw. Meanwhile, in a different wing of the precinct, behavioral analysts quietly built psychological profiles, attempts to understand the internal structure of the man now sitting in a county jail cell. They studied his interviews, his recorded phone calls, his history of meticulous architectural planning. He had lived his life by strict patterns, routines, schedules, repetitions that gave structure to everything he did. The question was whether those same patterns existed in the crimes investigators believed he committed. Patterns can reveal truth, but they can also create illusions. The analysts debated details late into the night. Some believed his calm behavior was a sign of internal certainty, a man who thought in straight lines and measured steps. Others believed it showed compartmentalization taken to an extreme, a life lived behind mental partitions, sealed off from consequence or empathy. Whatever the explanation, the consensus was clear. His personality did not fit the caricature many expected. He wasn't erratic or chaotic. He didn't seek attention. He didn't flaunt risk. His strength came from blending into the quiet corners of his own life, where familiarity made him invisible. Outside the investigative sphere, communities reacted in their own ways. Local libraries hosted discussions about personal safety. Neighborhood groups formed informal patrols. Parents talked in hushed tones at school sports events, torn between relief and disbelief. Some couldn't reconcile the image of a middle-aged architect, a man who lived among them, with the allegations printed across every newspaper. Others felt the arrest confirmed a fear they had carried silently for years. That danger can often hide inside the shape of everyday life. The tension reached deeper into families who had lived near the suspect for decades. Neighbors replayed encounters in their minds, a wave across the driveway, a conversation at the hardware store, a shared glance in the elevator. None of these moments had felt alarming. Yet in retrospect, they seemed unsettling simply because they existed in proximity to the headlines. It wasn't evidence, just the human mind searching for logic in events that defied reason. Inside the jail, Rex continued to surprise the few who spoke to him. He remained composed, analytical, even reservedly polite. Lawyers noted his ability to process information like a technical problem rather than a personal crisis. He corrected small errors, asked detailed questions, and maintained an unusual steadiness. It wasn't confidence, more like a deep-rooted habit of staying contained, as if he had spent his entire life training to preserve a mask that rarely slipped. Investigators, though, weren't focused on his demeanor. They were focused on expanding the boundaries of the search. That meant interviewing people who hadn't been contacted in years. Old coworkers, former friends, acquaintances from the early 2000s who barely remembered the specifics of their interactions. Many described him as quiet, intensely focused, even socially awkward at times. A few mentioned a temper that surfaced only when he felt disrespected or challenged. These details didn't solve the case, but they added color to the portrait detectives were constructing at the same time. Forensic teams revisited old evidence from the beach sites, soil samples, fibers, small fragments that technology had struggled to interpret years earlier. New methods allowed for deeper analysis. The painstaking work felt like reading faded ink under new light. Not everything was usable. Not everything held answers. But little by little, patterns emerged. Patterns that strengthened links investigators had only suspected before. By winter, The investigation had split into two distinct paths. One focused on the legal case, what could be proven in court, what was admissible, and what formed the backbone of the charges. The other path looked outward, toward unanswered questions, potential additional cases, and unexplored timelines. These were not accusations, but inquiries, attempts to understand whether the scope of the case reached beyond what was already known. Detectives expressed something they seldom said aloud, a sense of responsibility not just to the present case, but to the past, to all those families who waited years for answers, and to all those who fear their unanswered questions might remain unanswered forever. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when computer screens dimmed and only a handful of lights glowed inside the precinct, it was hard to escape the weight of the work. Every photograph, every map, every transcript carried the echo of someone's life. These weren't just case files. They were stories, interrupted, unresolved, waiting for clarity. And in the middle of it all stood the figure whose name had reshaped the narrative of the Gilgo Beach case. A name that had once belonged to just another Long Island resident. A man who caught the morning train and returned home after dark, living an ordinary life. Now that name lived inside every conversation, every headline, every investigative board, at a quiet storm but a shadow in plain sight, that a man at the center of one of the most complex cases Long Island had ever seen. And Chapter 13 was only the beginning of the questions still left to answer. Chapter 14. A community at the crossroads. Winter settled over Long Island in slow, heavy layers, coating neighborhoods in that familiar quiet that made everything feel softer, gentler, almost peaceful. But beneath the stillness, something else lingered, an unease that left porch lights on longer than usual, an instinctive tension woven into daily routines. People who once walked their dogs at night now waited for sunrise. Parents who once let children play freely outdoors found themselves watching from windows, scanning the street more than they realized. Rex Heuermann's arrest had fractured something intangible in the community. Not just trust, but the sense of understanding people believed they had of one another. Long Island wasn't a place of strangers. Neighbors grew up together, celebrated holidays, shared tools and stories in driveways. It was a place built on familiar rhythms, where even the sight of someone mowing their lawn or taking out trash added to a sense of normalcy. That normalcy was now under a microscope. In one quiet neighborhood near Massapequa Park, families gathered for small conversations, leaning in close, as if every word needed protection from the cold wind. They talked about memories of Rex, moments from years past that now felt heavier when replayed through the lens of the investigation. The man they once greeted with casual waves had become the subject of intense speculation. His presence, once unremarkable, now hovered over the block like a shadow that refused to fade. And the unsettling part was this: no one really knew him. Not truly. As investigators continued piecing together timelines and digital patterns, the community pieced together something else. Their own feelings about living next to someone accused of being at the center of one of the largest serial investigations in state history. Some wrestled with disbelief, replaying old conversations and realizing how calm, even gentle, he often seemed. Others tried to reconcile the two versions of the man in their minds: the quiet architect and the allegations that now filled nightly news cycles. Inside precincts, detectives worked through the same contradictions. They studied interviews, voice recordings, footage of Rex walking through hallways with a slow, deliberate pace. He never looked frantic or shaken. His expressions rarely changed. To some investigators, this neutrality felt eerie. A man separated from his own circumstances by an emotional distance they couldn't quite decode. But whether his demeanor came from denial, calculation, or simply an internal wiring different from most, the investigators knew something for certain. His calmness didn't change the evidence, and it wouldn't alter the path they were building toward trial. Meanwhile, media outlets intensified their coverage. News helicopters traced circles over the neighborhood. Journalists broadcast from snowy sidewalks. Their headlines carried a mixture of speculation, confirmed details, and broader questions about how danger can hide in plain sight. The constant attention was draining for residents who wanted their quiet lives back. Some covered windows to keep cameras from peering inside. Others avoided speaking publicly, afraid their words would be twisted or taken out of context. For detectives, the pressure grew in a different way. The case had become national, even international news. Every new development, big or small, was dissected across networks, podcasts, online forums. The weight of expectation pressed on the team daily. They weren't just solving a case. They were answering to families, communities, and a public desperate for closure after years of uncertainty. Inside the investigative headquarters, the mood fluctuated between moments of hope and long hours of grinding through silence. The team uncovered details that reinforced their theories, only to encounter new questions that tested their assumptions. Leads branched into tangents. Data sets required careful, patient analysis. Every connection had to be verified. Every inconsistency had to be explored. As they worked, they developed an unspoken rhythm, a shared understanding that solving something this complex required both precision and patience. Some days, progress felt like a flood. Other days, it felt like moving a stone 1 inch at a time. Yet slowly, steadily, the picture grew sharper. Patterns that once seemed abstract now aligned with surprising clarity. Small threads of information, random encounters, old sightings, forgotten witness statements, began to connect in a way that hadn't been possible before Rex became the focal point. What once felt like a maze now looked more like a map. And as the map expanded, so did the weight on detectives' shoulders. Each new revelation held the potential to widen the case, to deepen it, or to confirm suspicions that had lingered in the back of their minds for years. Not every detail was definitive. Not every lead was conclusive, but the direction was unmistakable. They were moving towards something larger than a single set of charges, something that stretched across time, places, and unanswered questions. Yet even with the growing clarity, the emotional gravity of the case remained. Detectives often found themselves standing by the office windows during late-night shifts, staring out at the snow-covered parking lot, letting the weight of the work settle for a moment. They knew the case was far from over. They knew trial preparations, forensic expansions, and broader investigations lay ahead. But for the first time in years, they also knew this. The truth was no longer hiding. It was emerging, slowly, quietly, undeniably. And Chapter 14 was the threshold between what the world once feared and what it would soon finally understand. As the investigation expanded, so did the quiet ripple of consequences moving through Long Island's everyday life. People who once drove past Gilgo Beach without a second thought now looked out the window a little longer, wondering how many secrets the coastline had carried all those years. The ocean waves continued rolling onto the sand with the same steady rhythm they always had, but in the minds of many residents, the beach no longer represented just calm or beauty. It represented unanswered questions, questions that lingered in the salt air long after the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside the precinct, detectives worked long past midnight. The fluorescent lights cast a soft, pale glow on stacks of files, evidence markers, empty coffee cups, and whiteboards filled with interlocking details. It wasn't chaos. It was a slow, methodical unraveling, a process that demanded patience, resilience, and a willingness to accept that the story they thought they knew was far more layered than they first believed. In one room, investigators examined a timeline stretched across an entire wall. Dates, locations, phone pings, ATM withdrawals, long drives taken in the dark hours before dawn. The timeline wasn't a perfect match to everything they suspected, but it held enough intersections to deepen their focus. Some lines overlapped with chilling precision. Others seemed to drift just outside the frame, hinting at possibilities that required further digging. Each time a new detail aligned, detectives didn't celebrate. They simply leaned in closer, acknowledging the gravity of what they were reconstructing. This wasn't about victories. It was about understanding a truth that had remained buried for far too long. In another part of the building, a team of analysts studied digital records, old emails, online accounts, search patterns, financial activity. They traced digital footprints like archaeologists uncovering layers of a forgotten civilization. Every file carried a timestamp, a location, a fragment of intent. Some were mundane, others deeply unsettling. Together, they painted the outline of a man who lived two parallel lives, one visible in the structure of his career and family, and another hidden in a carefully curated world of secrecy. But perhaps the most challenging part for investigators was understanding how so much could have existed without drawing attention sooner. They revisited conversations with neighbors, friends, and coworkers. Many described Rex as private but polite, intense but predictable, a man whose outward life seemed defined by routine. That sense of familiarity had made him nearly invisible, a part of the everyday background, like a lamppost you pass every morning but never really see. Some people struggled with guilt, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had never thought to look closer. That's the terrifying truth about quiet danger. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. As winter progressed, the public's curiosity intensified. People wanted answers, timelines, motives, explanations that would make the unthinkable feel somehow understandable. But the investigation didn't move at the pace of headlines. It moved carefully, deliberately, aware that each step carried weight. The case wasn't just about details. It was about people, families, and decades of grief held together by hope. Even with the growing body of evidence, investigators knew they needed to remain focused. The legal process would be long and complex. Every photograph, every report, every statement had to be prepared with precision. A case of this magnitude demanded clarity, and clarity came only through patience. During late-night shifts, when a precinct grew quiet and the hum of computers softened, some detectives reflected on how close the case had come to slipping through the cracks. If not for certain breaks, certain advancements in technology, certain patterns aligning after years of persistence, this story might still be sitting in an archive, waiting for the day someone happened to see what others had missed. Now that the truth was emerging, investigators felt a mix of relief and responsibility. Relief that years of work had brought them here. Responsibility because the journey ahead would still require everything they had. Every detail, every hour, every ounce of focus. Outside, snowfall thickened, covering streets in a blanket of white that softened the world into something quiet and still. From the windows of the precinct, it looked peaceful, almost serene. But the investigators inside knew better. Snow only covers the surface. It never erases what lies beneath. And beneath the surface of Long Island, beneath the headlines and the court filings and the community's unease, there was a truth the investigation was slowly, carefully bringing into the light, the truth about a man who blended into the world so completely that few ever saw the darker path running beside his everyday life, that a truth that would shape the next chapter of the case and redefine how an entire community understood the danger that once lived among them. Chapter 14 closed not with answers, but with a realization. Some stories don't end when someone is arrested. Sometimes, that's when the real story begins. Chapter 15. The Mask of Normalcy. The morning of the preliminary hearings arrived with a gray sky hanging low over Long Island, as if the weather itself understood the weight of the day. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered behind metal barricades, their breaths turning into pale clouds in the cold air. Cameras were already rolling, waiting to capture the first sight of the man at the center of the case that had shaken the region. But inside the courthouse, it was quieter. The hallways smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Officers stood watch in steady silence, their presence a reminder that this wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was the next major step in unraveling a story that had taken more than a decade to reach this point. When Rex Heuermann was brought in, there was no dramatic shift in his expression, no visible tension. His steps were deliberate, controlled. To an onlooker, it could have been anyone, a middle-aged man attending a civil case, a contractor appearing for a zoning dispute, a commuter caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was part of what made this case so gripping, so unsettling. The calmness, the stillness, The almost ordinary demeanor contrasted sharply with the enormity of the allegations. While attorneys prepared their arguments, investigators filled the benches in the back of the room. They sat quietly, hands folded, eyes forward. To them, this wasn't the end of anything. It was the continuation of everything they had worked for. They weren't here to witness the performance of a courtroom. They were here to ensure that the truth they had fought for remained intact as it transitioned into the legal arena. The prosecution spoke first, outlining the foundation of their case. They didn't raise their voices or lean into dramatic language. Instead, they presented the timeline with crisp clarity, cell data, witness statements, physical evidence, forensic alignments. Each detail landed with a steady weight, building a structure of facts designed to withstand scrutiny. Defense attorneys countered with confidence, challenging interpretations, questioning the reliability of certain data points, and emphasizing the importance of due process. Their arguments weren't emotional, they were strategic. Every phrase was chosen to chip at the prosecution's foundation, to remind the court that even the most detailed investigations require careful examination. As the exchanges continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, not toward tension, but toward a deep, reflective stillness. Everyone present understood the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't a case about speculation or theories whispered across the news. This was about evidence, intention, and the difficult path toward truth that in the community, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief, believing justice was finally within reach. Others felt uneasy, sensing that the story was far from complete. And many remained somewhere in between, caught between the desire for closure and the realization that closure in cases like this rarely comes cleanly. While the hearing moved forward, detectives in the precinct continued their parallel work. The legal process didn't stop the investigation. If anything, it intensified it. Every new detail raised new questions. Old theories were re-examined under fresh light. Every unexplored pathway was reconsidered. Because in cases of this size, the legal proceedings and the investigation are two sides of the same massive structure, each strengthening the other, each demanding absolute precision. Back at the courthouse, observers watched Heuermann closely. They searched for subtle tells, a twitch of a hand, a shift in posture, a flicker of emotion behind the eyes. But his face remained composed, his expression unreadable. It was as if he stood behind an invisible pane of glass, separated from the emotional currents swirling around him. Some speculated that this was his nature. Others argued it was strategic. A few wondered if it was simply shock, the type that takes hold when the structure of one's life begins to collapse in slow motion. But no one could truly know what moved behind that still exterior. As recess was called, attorneys gathered their files. Officers guided Heuermann down a quiet hallway, footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. The day wasn't over. Not for him, not for the investigators, not for the families watching this unfold from a distance. Outside, the crowd shifted, reporters leaning over barricades for a glimpse of something. Anything that might become the next headline. The snow had stopped, but the air remained cold, settled with the kind of heaviness that comes from knowing you're standing in the middle of a story much larger than yourself. Inside the courthouse, the walls held the quiet truth. This case was no longer an investigation alone, that it was a legal odyssey, one that would stretch forward, chapter by chapter, each step heavier than the last. And in this moment, at this threshold between past and future, everyone involved understood something unspoken. Story wasn't nearing its end, it was deepening, becoming sharper, becoming real. As the hearing resumed, a subtle shift filled the courtroom. The quiet murmur from earlier had faded, replaced by a focused stillness. Attorneys re-entered with fresh pages in hand. Investigators leaned slightly forward in their seats, and observers settled into a silence that felt almost reverent. Everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would shape the next chapter of a saga already years in the making. The prosecution continued layering its argument, not in broad strokes, but with deliberate, careful detail. They described phone records that placed wrecks in key areas during critical windows of time. They presented testimony from witnesses whose recollections formed small but meaningful pieces of the puzzle. They referenced forensic analysis that tied together items collected over the years, threads woven through time, now pulled together into a single, unfolding narrative. IT wasn't sensational. IT wasn't theatrical. That IT was methodical. Exactly the kind of measured, steady pressure that builds the foundation for a long, complex case. The defense countered with methodical precision of their own. They questioned reliability. They highlighted gaps. They emphasized the possibility of alternative explanations. Their tone was calm, professional, carefully chosen to remind the court that a case of this magnitude demands scrutiny at every turn. For the families of the victims, watching from afar or sitting quietly inside the gallery, the experience was emotionally layered. On one hand, there's a sense of progress. Finally, concrete legal steps after years of living with unanswered questions. On the other, they carried a weight that few people could truly understand. The weight of loss stretched across a decade, mixed with hope, fear, and the exhaustion of waiting for resolution. Through it all, Rex remained composed. He listened. He blinked occasionally. He adjusted his glasses. But nothing in his demeanor gave away a single telling emotion. It was as though he had trained himself to be unreadable, a man living inside a careful shell. No tension in the jaw, no shift of the shoulders, no flicker of recognition when evidence was described. To the observers, it was unsettling. To investigators, it was expected. Outside, the scene remained charged. Reporters stood ready through the cold, reciting updates into microphones. Spectators gathered at the barricades, some hoping for a glimpse, others simply trying to process the reality of living so close to a story that had captured national attention. Across the country, people followed the coverage online, drawn by the strange duality at the heart of the case. A man who seemed ordinary yet was accused of extraordinary crimes. As the afternoon wore on, the hearing shifted from witness points to procedural matters, schedules, requirements for further discovery, the timeline for the next phase. It was a reminder that the justice system moves not by emotion, but by structure. Every case, no matter how massive or chilling, must follow a path defined by law. And that path can be slow. When the judge finally announced a recess for the day, the room exhaled in a way that felt almost audible. Attorneys gathered their files. Detectives stepped out to take calls. Court clerks organized the next round of paperwork. The process was far from over. In truth, it was barely beginning, but each step represented progress. An officer approached Rex and motioned for him to stand. Once again, he rose calmly. There was no visible frustration, no signs of strain. He walked with the same deliberate pace, disappearing down the hallway as cameras outside prepared for a wave of new updates. For investigators, though, the work was not paused by the adjournment. They returned to their desks with new questions, new angles to explore, and renewed resolve. Some reviewed old files with fresh eyes. Others revisited timelines, looking for subtle inconsistencies or emerging patterns. Still, others joined analysts to monitor ongoing forensic evaluations, each hoping to uncover the next piece of truth that would strengthen the path ahead. In quiet conversations, detectives reflected not just on the progress made, but on the weight of what remained. Cases like this aren't linear. They branch, shift, expand. Every answer question can reveal 3 more. And every step forward requires the kind of patience that is built not from training, but from years spent chasing truth in its most elusive form. Meanwhile, the community outside continued adapting to its new reality. Some residents tried to reclaim their routines, choosing to believe that the worst was behind them. Others found themselves still looking over their shoulders, their trust shaken. And still others approached the situation with quiet resilience, determined not to let fear reshape the place they called home. Night fell early, casting long shadows across the courthouse. Snow from the morning had begun to melt, leaving the streets damp and reflective. In those reflections, the flashing blue and red lights of patrol cars shimmered like distant echoes of the years spent unraveling the story that had led everyone to this point. as the courthouse emptied and the precinct lights hummed softly through the evening, one truth remained steady. The case was no longer sleeping, IT was awake, unfolding and growing clearer. And as investigators prepared for the next phase, as families braced for future hearings, as the public continued watching with a mix of fear and fascination, one thing felt certain. This story, this long, complex, unsettling story, was far from over. IT was entering a new stage, at a stage where the past and future would collide in a courtroom built for answers, and the next chapter would demand even more from those determined to see this case through to the very end. Final chapter, the quiet echo after the storm, when the long months of hearings, evidence reviews, and investigations finally slowed into a steady rhythm. Something unusual happened across Long Island. Silence returned. Not the peaceful kind that drifts through neighborhoods during winter mornings, but a thoughtful silence. The kind that grows after a community has seen too much, learned too much, and will never view the world quite the same way again. For years, the Gilgo Beach case had been a mystery hovering at the edge of every conversation. It lived in the background like a shadow no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. And now, with Rex Heuermann behind bars and the investigation unfolding piece by piece, that shadow was no longer shapeless. It had form, structure, a face that had once blended so easily into the daily rhythm of Long Island life. In the courthouse, the final days of the hearings passed with a kind of quiet inevitability. Eternis repeated familiar arguments. Investigators confirmed details with calm precision. Journalists scribbled notes with practiced urgency. But the intensity that once electrified the air had softened into something else: acceptance. The early shock had faded. The community now understood that the story would not vanish quickly, nor would it resolve neatly. It would stretch forward, step by step, into trials, appeals, and long legal pathways. And yet, beneath that acceptance, there was something steadier: resolve. Detectives who had spent over a decade with this case carried themselves differently now. The uncertainty that once haunted them had lifted. They knew the work wasn't over. Far from it. But they also knew they had reached a place many of them feared they'd never see. A place where answers outnumber questions, where truth no longer hid in sand dunes and dark corridors. In quiet moments, some of the investigators looked back on the early days of the case. The night spent mapping coastline tracks, the interviews that led nowhere, the tips that flickered out before they could catch fire. They remembered the frustration, the exhaustion, the desperate hope that one day a lead would break open the silence. Now that it had, they carried a mix of pride and grief, knowing the victory belonged not to them, but to the families who had waited far too long for justice to breathe. Outside, Long Island shifted into a slower heartbeat. Porch lights still glowed later than usual. People still drove a little more cautiously through dark stretches of road. But gradually, the community understood something that had once felt impossible. Life moves forward even after it's been shaken. The world bends, but it does not break. Even near Gilgo Beach, where the ocean continued its endless rhythm, people began walking along the sand again. Slowly, quietly, with respect for the part of their home that had been changed forever. And perhaps that was the most human part of the story. The way people learned to coexist with the truth, to live with the knowledge that danger had once walked beside them without ever announcing its presence. In his cell, Rex Heuermann remained the same. Calm, contained, and unreadable. Some saw that composure as unsettling. Others saw it as a man living in a world he never expected to face. But whatever the interpretation, it didn't change the reality unfolding around him. The law would move forward. Evidence would speak. The story would continue without him needing to say a single word. Months from now, the courtroom would fill again. Attorneys would stand. Witnesses would testify. Forensic experts would explain their findings. Families would watch with quiet courage. And the process would continue, not for headlines, but for truth. Because truth, once uncovered, does not return to darkness. It stays in the light. And as this chapter draws to a close, as the echoes of this case settle into the history of Long Island, one quiet realization lingers. This wasn't just a story about investigation or suspicion or the unraveling of a man who hid in plain sight. That IT was a story about persistence, about community, about the strength it takes to keep searching when answers feel impossibly far away. That IT was a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but it arrives piece by piece, step by step, in the steady hands of those who refuse to stop looking. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let that truth settle softly. Even in the darkest mysteries, there are people who stand in the light, quietly, patiently, until the shadows finally give way. Thank you for listening. And remember, this is True Crime Records. New stories await you every night.